It is November 19th, 1966. Paul McCartney and his girlfriend, Jane Asher, fly out of Nairobi, Kenya, on their way back to London. For nearly 2 weeks, Paul has jetted and driven all throughout Europe and then into Africa, much of it while in disguise, an experience that Paul, who for years now could not take one step outside without hordes of fans and press converging upon him, found incredibly liberating. For just a moment there, he was able to step back inside of himself, inside of the Paul that he knew, rather than Paul, the world-famous Beatle. So as the plane soars back to London, back to the heart of Beatlemania, back to the crushing demands of his everyday life, Paul begins to think of a different reality. A reality where he and the Beatles are not the mop-top sensations, the boys whose duty it is to be wheeled out before thousands and thousands of screaming fans over and over, day after day, a product to be packaged, sold, and consumed. He imagined that they were something else entirely, that they themselves could don a disguise, just as he had done on his vacation. Paul had an idea. Welcome to the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Time to rewind. On August 29th, the Beatles played at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, a performance that would mark the end of the most nightmarish year of touring that they had endured yet, and the show that would turn out to be their very last as a touring group. It had all been far too much, and for the first time in their history, it was time not to speed up, but finally to slow down. John jets off to Spain, where he is to star as Private Gripweed in Richard Lester's How I Won the War.
Well, our officer calls me up and he says to me, Musketeer Gripweed. He was a tall chap. Some would call him Weedy. I did.
George and Patty head down to Bombay, India, where George is to take sitar lessons from his mentor, Ravi Shankar. Paul and Ringo simply take a breather. The Beatles, as the world and their adoring fans know them, have vanished. But one evening, at the Santa Isabel villa where he is staying, John sits down and records a demo of a song he has been writing during his time in Spain. It is named Strawberry Fields Forever. On Monday, September 26th, Brian Epstein was hospitalized. It will later be revealed that this was due to a drug overdose. But he's right back to action on the 3rd of October, where he insists, despite the lack of news from them, that the Beatles are still very much together, with no intention of splitting. He does confirm, however, for the moment at least, that there are no plans for any upcoming Beatles concerts. This does little to quell the rumors. On October 9th, John celebrates his 26th birthday, still in Spain for How I Won the War. He is joined by Ringo and his wife Maureen.
Yeah, I went and hung out because he was lonely. And, we really supported each other a lot. And so, he was out there being this actor.
The month goes on. As far as Beatles news is concerned, still nothing. But the world keeps spinning, for better, and as it often is, for worse. On the morning of October 21st, in Aberfan, Wales, a spoil tip, saturated with rainwater, suffered a partial but massive collapse, and the resulting slide surged down the mountain toward the village, a wave of liquefied debris 30 feet high. On its way down, it demolishes a farm, as well as 2 water mains, intensifying the flow, before tragically reaching the village, where it collides with the Pantglass Junior School. taking the lives of 109 children and 5 teachers. It was a horrific tragedy, one with significant cultural, political, and environmental implications. In times like these, a country turns toward its voices and leaders, a position that the Beatles, like it or not, occupy. So on November 6th, Brian Epstein is put in the awkward position of turning down a request for the Beatles to perform at a benefit for the victims of the Aberfan disaster. Brian wrote to the organizers, "Sincere admiration for your efforts, but I know without consulting them, the boys would feel unable to make an appearance of this sort for too many reasons to enumerate. However, subject to confirmation, I am sure they, and I, would gladly contribute £200 each to the fund to help." That is equivalent to about £3,200 today. On the very same day, Paul begins his driving tour of France. Paul, clever as he is, commissioned from Wig Creations, the cosmetic company that had worked with the Beatles for A Hard Day's Night, a simple disguise for him to wear during his holiday. They measure you and match the color of your hair, so it was like a genuine mustache with real glue. And I had a couple of pairs of glasses made with clear lenses, which just made me look a bit different. I put a long blue overcoat on and slicked my hair back with Vaseline and just wandered around, and of course nobody recognized me. In the morning, Paul drove his Aston Martin up onto the plane ferry at Lydd Airport, Kent. Yes, you heard correctly, a plane ferry. For your car. He arrived in France and first drove down to Paris, where he basked in his temporary anonymity, spending much of his time filming home videos throughout the city. I did a film that I wish I had now. I filmed a gendarme on traffic duty in Paris, and he was just stopping all the cars, so that was one roll through. It was a Bolex camera, and you could rewind so you could then go through again. The second time, he'd gone, so I just filmed all the traffic. It looked like this impossible job where the traffic was just going through him all the time. And while Paul was busy filming traffic in Paris, John returned to England, where he would stop by the Indica bookstore and gallery to attend a preview of an exhibition that would be opening there the next day. Unfinished paintings and objects by Yoko Ono.
And I had a bit of a hang-up about art too, having been to art school, and disliked the sort of attitude of the so-called artist, you know. So anyway, I finally got to this show, and she had all these things on, like all these like hammer nail things, and that clock there, you listen to it through and at first I reacted like a mug, you know, like the ones that were saying they don't get a badge, you know. I was thinking, haha, don't fool me with all this junk, you know. So then there was this ladder and a thing on the ceiling. So I climbed the ladder, and on the ceiling it said, yes. You see, so I thought, oh, I agreed then. And then she came up and said, do you like to hammer a nail in? It's 5 shillings. So I said,
you didn't want to pay.
I didn't have any money either, so I said, I'll hammer an imaginary nail in and give you an imaginary 5 shillings. And she agreed to that, she accepted that, on the same basis as we accept her work, you know. I'd accepted her work, and that was how we met, actually.
A few days later, back in France, Paul drove down to Bordeaux, where he planned to meet with roadie Mal Evans. On the evening of the 11th, Paul, still in disguise, attempted to enter a discotheque, but was turned down by the bouncer. For the first time during his holiday, he felt the downside of being a quote-unquote nobody. So he returned to the discotheque, this time as Beatle Paul, where he was of course welcomed with open arms. And this reminded Paul that yes, he did like being famous. It was nice because I remembered what it was like to not be famous, and it wasn't necessarily any better than being famous. Beautifully put, Paul. On the 12th, Paul met with Mal Evans, and the two began driving through the south of France. Our route took us through San Sebastian, Madrid, Cordoba, and Malaga to Torremolinos. The original intention was to drive east all along the coastline beside the Mediterranean and meet up with John at Almeria. But by phoning London, we found that John had finished work on How I Won the War earlier than expected. Let's hear from Mal. That's torn it, explained Paul. Okay, how about a safari as compensation? Spain isn't really safari country, Paul, I replied blankly. "No, but Kenya is," came the prompt reply. In no time, the spur-of-the-moment schedule was planned. We flew to Madrid, then another plane from Madrid to the city of Nairobi in Kenya. So it was here in Nairobi that they were joined by Jane Asher, and the trio spent their time sightseeing, staying at the famous Treetop Hotel, the hotel where Queen Elizabeth II had been residing when she ascended to the throne in 1952. On the 19th, they headed back to England. So we finally circle back to our intro. On the plane ride home, Paul dreams up the alter ego of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And the story behind that name, specifically, is one that Paul has told hundreds and hundreds of times. Let's hear it again.
At the time, there were lots of those sort of bands that were, Laughing Joe and his medicine band, Thank You, Wham Bam Mam. So I just thought, if there was a band, what would be a mad name for it?
I was on a plane with our roadie and we were eating and he said, "Could you pass the salt and pepper?" And I thought he said Sgt. Pepper. I said, "What?" He said, "Salt and pepper." I said, "Oh, I thought you said Sgt. Pepper." So we had a laugh about that, but then the more I thought about it, Sgt. Pepper, that's kind of a cool character.
So at last, all four Beatles are in England, having spent more time apart than they have in years. In fact, possibly since they first left for Hamburg in 1960. Time to get back to work. The Beatles had made significant strides with Revolver, not only as an evolution of their songwriting, but sonically, aesthetically, using the recording studio as a creative weapon. And now, it was time to once again dial it up a notch. On their return to the studio on the 24th, the Beatles made it clear, right away, that things were going to continue to change. Jeff Emmerich shares the following account. John Lennon was even more agitated than usual. "Look," he said to George Martin, "it's really quite simple. We're fed up with making soft music for soft people, and we're fed up with playing for them too. But it's given us a fresh start, don't you see?" From the expression on his face, it was clear that George Martin didn't see. "We can't hear ourselves on stage anymore for all the screaming," Paul interjected earnestly. "So what's the point? We did try performing some songs off the last album, but there are so many complicated overdubs we can't do them justice. Now we can record anything we want, and it won't matter. And what we want is to raise the bar a notch, to make our best album ever." Another blank look from George Martin. Lennon persisted, talking rapid fire, a sure sign that he was starting to get annoyed. "What we're saying is, if we don't have to tour, then we can record music that we won't ever have to play live. And that means we can create something that's never been heard before, a new kind of record with new kinds of sounds." George Martin asked, "Right then, let's get to work. What have you got for me?" Paul started to say something, but before he could answer, John shouted out, "I've got a good one, for a starter." John could talk over most anyone if he wanted to, and he was never shy about jumping the queue. In fact, the first session for almost every Beatles album was devoted to recording one of his songs. A half smile played across Paul's face as he shrugged his shoulders, backing down gracefully. Phil McDonald and I strained to hear what was going on downstairs. Down in the studio, George Martin was perched, as usual, on his high stool, positioned in the midst of the four Beatles. John was standing directly in front of him, playing an acoustic guitar and singing softly. Because he wasn't close to any of the microphones we had arranged around the room, I had to push the faders up quite high to hear him. From the very first note, it was obvious that this new Lennon song was a masterpiece. He had created a gentle, almost mystical tribute to some mysterious place, a place he called Strawberry Fields. I had no idea what the lyric was about, but the words were compelling, like abstract poetry, and there was something magical in the spooky, detached timbre of John's voice. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, broken by Paul, who in a quiet, respectful tone said simply, "That is absolutely brilliant." Most of the time, when Lennon played one of his songs through for the first time on acoustic guitar, we'd all think, "Wow, that's great." But this song was clearly something special. An instrument new to the recording studio, but already familiar to John, was moved from his home in Weybridge down to EMI Studios in London, and it is this instrument that immediately gives Strawberry Fields Forever its unique and timeless quality, the mellotron. Time for some history. The mellotron was developed in 1963 in Birmingham and was the younger, more charismatic sibling of a similar instrument, the Chamberlin. They are both electromechanical instruments, and the way they work is this. Rather than the depression of a particular key triggering the reverberation of a string, it instead triggers a playback head on a feed of audio tape. And this audio tape is what makes the instrument tick. Within the machine is contained audio tape of a variety of instruments running the scale of the keyboard. When the desired instrument is selected, like the violin, or in the case of Strawberry Fields, the flute, it will be the tape recordings of this instrument that will play on triggering of the key. And while the instrument may have been John's baby, it was not he, but Paul, who devised and composed the iconic mellotron medley that leads us into the world of Strawberry Fields. So on this day, the band recorded one brilliant take of the song, with John on guitar and lead vocal, Paul on mellotron, and Ringo on drums. Happy with the take, they immediately set to overdubs. John double-tracked his vocals, Ringo added maracas, George and Paul added backing harmonies, and George also added additional mellotron for good measure. All of the recording for this day was done at 53 cycles. I can't speak for the specifics of this number, but the result of recording at this frequency was that on replay, the song played back ever so slightly faster, resulting in a marginal but noticeably higher pitch.
Living is easy with eyes closed. Living is easy with eyes closed.
We will see the Beatles utilize this technique all throughout Sgt. Pepper's. George Martin would recall, "It was a magical evening. We all loved the beginning to our new album and went home in the early hours of the next morning, tired but satisfied." This first recording is stunning, and yet this was just the beginning. And what better way to follow up Strawberry Fields than with the annual Beatles Christmas record? It's that time of year, all right. This pantomime-themed Christmas record was, unsurprisingly, mostly a Paul creation. The recording is a whole production, told in comedic, storybook fashion, ending with the piano-led finale, "Everywhere is Christmas."
Everywhere is Christmas. At the end of every year. Oh, everywhere is Christmas. At the end of every year.
Later in the day, both John and Paul, along with a star-studded cast of other musicians, including Donovan, Eric Clapton, Pete Townsend, Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, and Brian Jones, would attend a press reception at the Bag O' Nails Club for the Jimi Hendrix Experience, in which Jimi and his band nearly blew the roof off the damn place. It would be hard to overstate just how much admiration and excitement Jimi Hendrix generated, not just before a crowd of fans, but before some of the most successful and talented musicians in the world. We'll now read an excerpt of writing from a lucky fan who did get to attend the reception, Charles Hawley. "My girlfriend Winifred managed to get 2 tickets, and we were the only people present who weren't part of rock's hierarchy. No one was more gobsmacked than Clapton. I was torn between watching his face and Hendrix's performance."
Yeah, we're gonna try to do one more song for you, all right?
Before John and Paul left, they stopped by the dressing rooms to give their regards, as hilariously recalled by Noel Redding. Afterwards, in the dressing room, Lennon walked in, which freaked me out. He was saying, "Fucking grand." He loved it. And then McCartney walked in, and that freaked me out even more.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields.
Strawberry Fields would continue to evolve. Unlike the first take recorded the last session, which jumped right into the verse, this recording began with a beautifully simple mellotron intro, played by Paul. Hearing the instrument unaccompanied, isolated, and alone allows one to hear the unique characteristic of the sound and is the perfect introduction into the world that Strawberry Fields creates. Paul's inspiration really set the stage. In many ways, it was a harbinger of things to come over the next several months. The perfect, unique introduction to a series of near-perfect, near-unique sessions. Work on the rhythm track continued until the next day, with additional overdubs added, as well as artificially doubling John's vocal, which was his preference by this point. The song was fleshing out, but was it for the better? Time will tell. We move into December, and with December, of course, comes another edition of the Beatles Monthly, which contained a written excerpt from a press conference, including one question I found humorous. The interviewer asked, "Are you all going to have a hand in writing your next movie?" To which John responded, "Who? Me? I don't think so. I'd sooner leave somebody else to write our film scripts. I don't know how to do it." Maybe Paul took this as a challenge. The Beatles began their day by recording Christmas messages for pirate radio stations, Radio Caroline and Radio London. Time for another very quick history lesson. At this period of time in the UK, the BBC had complete domain over radio broadcasting. If you wanted radio, guess what? Your only choice was BBC. And quite a few people weren't so happy about this. Radio Caroline and Radio London, to circumvent broadcasting laws, literally took their equipment out to sea into international waters, where they could get away with what would normally be an illegal broadcast. Their stations were such an enormous success that the BBC would copy the format of their programming. These pirate stations directly led to the creation of the BBC Radio 1 pop station. More so, hilariously, many of these illegal radio jockeys from both Caroline and London would later end up employed at BBC. Lesson over. The Beatles, in a show of support for these pirate stations, took the time to record them some special messages.
Everywhere it's Christmas, so this is John Lennon wishing you a very happy one.
On behalf of the Beatles, it is Paul McCartney saying, have a happy Christmas holiday, and is wishing you success and good health all through 1967.
After that, it was time for another act of defiance, led by Paul, to stop the erasure of granny music from popular culture. Just kidding. Today, they began work on the first song that would actually end up on the Sgt. Pepper's LP, When I'm 64. This song was one of the first that Paul had ever written, with its origins dating all the way back to April or May of 1956, when Paul was 14 years old. The song would float around as a novelty during their set list for years to come.
The very, very last time we played with the Beatles was August the 3rd, 1963. We went down a store and the Beatles went on, and we couldn't wait to see them because we hadn't seen them for a few months. And the power went. All the Beatles gear had gone off. And so the Beatles, being the Beatles, didn't bother them at all. They just, Paul went on the piano, John and George playing their guitars. You could just about hear the guitars because they were playing them acoustically, no amplifiers. And Paul played this, what we thought was a musical song, an old musical song. And we thought that for many years. We didn't remember it until I heard it 3 or 4 years later. And it was, when I get older, losing my hair, many years from now. Well, it was, that was the song.
Being well practiced, the song needed little rehearsal, and they put down 2 very basic rhythm tracks, composed only of Paul's bass, John's rhythm guitar, some drums from Ringo, and a guide vocal from Paul.
When I get older, losing my hair.
Next, they overdubbed piano and a snare from Ringo. George, a staunch critic of granny music, did not participate on the recording, despite being present at the session. George Martin had not been too thrilled with the past few recordings of Strawberry Fields. He himself was still firmly in favor of the much more gentle initial take, and he said as much to John following the day's work back on the 29th. It started to get heavy. It wasn't the gentle song I had first heard. We ended up with a record which was very good heavy rock. Still, that was apparently what John wanted, so I metaphorically shrugged my shoulders and said, well, that wasn't really what I'd thought of, but it's okay. And off John went. A week later, he came back and said, I've been thinking about it too, George. Maybe what we did was wrong. I think we ought to have another go at doing it. It was decided that the song would be remade, and John asked George Martin to arrange a score for the song, with Paul helping to contribute some of the musical ideas they would like to include. George Martin agreed. But Martin wouldn't be present at the studio today, nor Jeff Emmerich, who begrudgingly agreed to accompany Martin to the premiere of Cliff Richard's film, Finders Keepers. In their absence, Dave Harries took over the session, and the Beatles, sensing that Mommy and Daddy had left them alone, went a little wild on the remake of the song's rhythm track. When Martin and Emmerich returned from their film, they found the Beatles still there, at the studio. When Jeff and I strolled in at about 11, Studio 2 was in the grip of a controlled riot. The boys had decided it would be fun to lay down an unusual rhythm track on their own, with anyone and everybody available simply banging away on whatever came to hand. The racket as we walked in was like something from a very bad Tarzan movie. John and Paul were bashing bongo drums. George was on huge kettle drums, joined sporadically by Paul. Neil Aspinall was playing a gourd scraper, Mal Evans a tambourine, and George's friend Terry Duran was shaking maracas. Someone else was tinkling away on finger cymbals. Above it all, Ringo was struggling manfully to keep the cacophony together with his regular drum kit. The Beatles were at play, and here I was coming in to party poop. Towards the end of this rogue track, which Dave Harries, as stand-in engineer, was doing his best to record, everyone was whooping or yelling, and John can clearly be heard chanting, very slowly, and in time to the rough and ready beat. Why cranberry sauce? Why not? It was coming up to Christmas. It was now time for extensive overdubbing, and once again, the Beatles brought their creative best, as recalled by George Martin. George Harrison brought in a swarmandal, a sort of North Indian table harp. The only way he knew how to play it was to stroke it as you would a real harp, so he spent ages tuning it to produce the right selection of notes. His patience rewarded us well, because the glissando he charmed out of the instrument was tremendous, adding a fantastically good effect when we dropped it into our rhythm track. John discovered a way of making the mellotron play not just one, but a whole random sequence of notes, which gives Strawberry Fields Forever another marvelous touch of madness towards the end. Paul then came up with an inspired piece of ringing lead guitar work that rounded the song off brilliantly. It was this combination of different elements, traditional rock, Indian influence, and the utilization of more recent technology, like the mellotron, that would come to define the sound of Sgt. Pepper's, as well as massively influencing the sound of psychedelia going forward. But let's make one thing clear. As of this day, no pop song had ever sounded like Strawberry Fields.
But you know I know and it's a dream.
It was finally the day to record George Martin's string and brass arrangement for Strawberry Fields, and doing so was no easy feat. Martin had packed a fair amount of complexity in the song's 4 minutes. I confess I had heard a lot of American records with very groovy horn sections by this time, and lifted 1 or 2 ideas from them. As the song developed further, it seemed natural to use the trumpets as a harmony behind the voice, sounding the same phrase as in our lovely intro. Then came the only section I had qualms about. At this particular point, the tempo is held together by a fast rhythm from a cymbal that Ringo recorded back backwards. Never an easy sound to latch onto. The cellos worked against this urgent beat with a slower, triplet time motif, and I was not at all sure that it was going to work. But now, I am happy to say, I cannot imagine the song without it. Recording the parts I had written was very difficult to get exactly right. All 4 trumpets had to play loud, punchy, spiky stabs in perfect time, while the cello parts demanded equally accurate and strident bowing. They had to fit our frenetic rhythm track to perfection, which I found to be virtually impossible. I had quite forgotten that our kindergarten rhythm play-in inevitably did not conform to a rigid quartz-controlled beat. The tempo was all over the place. After some patience, the feat was complete, and to finish the day off, John overdubbed additional lead vocals and some harmonies. On the 16th of December, Beatles fans everywhere breathed a long sigh of relief as the anxiously awaited 4th Beatles Christmas message came tumbling down their chimneys. Beatles goon it up again, writes New Musical Express. All is well in the world. But late at night, the next day, a man and his girlfriend are driving through South Kensington. He's a wealthy young man, with a fast car to boot. His name is Tara Brown, heir to the Guinness fortune. He is only 21 years old. For some years now, he's been very interested in art, and having plenty of money to throw around, he has used it to ingratiate himself in the swinging London scene, financing exhibits and mod shops, and making himself quite a few famous friends, including Brian Jones and Paul McCartney. In fact, it has even been rumored that he was there for Paul's very first LSD trip. His girlfriend's name is Suki Patier. She is 19 years old and works as a model in London. They leave a restaurant at 11:50 p.m., and as midnight nears, Tara speeds down the road. Whether it be a result of the speed and the alcohol, or a tragic lapse in attention, Tara fails to see a traffic light ahead and runs through the junction of Redcliffe Square and Redcliffe Gardens, hitting a parked lorry at high speeds. Tara would suffer significant head injuries and die in the hospital the next day. Suki, miraculously, was not injured. She claims he swerved the car at the last moment so that the driver's side took the brunt of the crash. The tragic story would run in the Daily Mirror newspaper the next day, on the 19th. It is now time for the orchestral overdubs for Paul's When I'm 64, and Paul tells Martin he would like them to have a, quote, tooty sound. How lovely. Paul wants to use clarinets for the song, and Martin agrees. Clarinets it shall be. And whether Paul intended it or not, Martin recalls that the additions of clarinets, quote, gave added bite to the song, a formality that pushed it firmly towards satire. Without that, the song could have been misinterpreted. It was very tongue-in-cheek. And with that, the very first song to be included on the Sgt. Pepper's LP is complete. Strawberry Fields had been weighing heavily on John's mind. Everything recorded so far had been good. Fantastic, in fact. But still, something wasn't right. They had initially finished the song in late November, before John decided they should remake it. So they did, orchestral overdubs and all, and by December 15th, they had finished it again. But just a few days after that, John came up to speak to both Geoff Emerick and George Martin. He had an idea. The following account was shared by Emerick. John says, I've been listening to these acetates of Strawberry Fields a lot, and I've decided that I still prefer the beginning of the original version. My jaw dropped. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see George Martin blinking slowly. I could almost detect his blood pressure rising. Ignoring both of us, Lennon continued. So what I'd like our young Jeffrey here to do is join the two bits together. George Martin let out a big sigh. John, we'd be glad to do that, he said, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. The only thing that stands in our way is the fact that the two versions were played in different keys and at different tempos. John appeared nonplussed. I'm not sure he even understood why that presented a problem. You can do it, he said simply. With that, he turned and headed out the door. What do you think, Jeff? A deflated George asked me, after John had gone. My reply was non-committal. I'm not sure. I guess all we can do is have a go. So Martin and Emmerich went to the task. I think it is sometimes forgotten, to the casual fan at least, just how significant the contributions of both Martin and Emmerich were. They were world-class engineers, creative visionaries in their own right, and to add to that, they knew how to navigate the world of the Beatles, the egos, the outlandish ideas. It was time to do so, again. George Martin recalled, "John always left this kind of thing to me. He never professed to know anything about recording. He was the least technical of the Beatles. He had a profound faith in my ability to cope with such problems, a faith which was sometimes misplaced, as I certainly felt it was on this occasion. But I had to have a go. I listened to the two versions again, and suddenly realized that with a bit of luck, I might get away with it, because, with the way that the keys were arranged, the slower version was a semitone flat, compared with the faster one. We called up our magnificent band of backroom boys, who wheeled in a Diplodocus-sized washing machine look-alike, the frequency changer. This valve-powered monster, a lash-up devised by Ken Townsend, our chief engineer, and his merry men, took the mains electricity supply and bent the alternating current up and down on either side of the normal 50 cycles per second. Don't ask me how they did it. I haven't a clue. What I can tell you is that it used to get very hot and would explode in a shower of sparks if you stretched it too far. But it was all we had. We hooked it up. We were looking for a point in the song where there was a sound change, which would help us disguise the edit of the century. We found it precisely 1 minute in. I thought, if I can speed up the one and slow down the other, I can get the pitches the same. And with any luck, the tempos will be sufficiently close not to be noticeable. I did just that, selecting precisely the right spot to make the cut, to join them as nearly perfectly as possible. That is how Strawberry Fields was issued, and that is how it remains today. The Beatles were not present during the madness, but John stopped by afterward. According to Emmerich, John popped by to see how we were getting on. I had literally finished the edit just a few moments before he arrived. As we played the results of our labors to John for the first time, he listened carefully, head down, deep in concentration. I made a point of standing in front of the tape machine so that he couldn't see the splice go by. A few seconds after the edit flew past, Lennon lifted his head up and a grin spread across his face. "Has it passed yet?" he asked. "Sure had," I replied proudly. "Well, good on you, Jeffrey," he said. He absolutely loved what we had done. We played it over and over again that night for John, and at the conclusion each time, he'd turn to us and repeat the same 3 words, eyes wide with excitement. Brilliant. Just brilliant. With that, and the holidays fast approaching, the Beatles took a moment to breathe, thrilled with the work they had completed so far. It was time for a short break, but Paul was working away on what may have been a response to John's Strawberry Fields. Paul's own approach to that same tinted nostalgia, a series of pictures passing before a child's eyes. And this place was a street named Penny Lane. There could not be a more perfect encapsulation of the dichotomy between a John lyric and a Paul lyric, even when writing for an extremely similar subject matter. They both present to the listener a transportive, sacred place, a place perhaps representing a sense of comfort, of escape, and through the communication of that idea, we see just how differently John and Paul view the world. Throughout the lyrics of Strawberry Fields, John presents both a deep insecurity, a sense of feeling othered, while at the same time displaying a defiance, a turning away from judgment, both from himself or others. It is an incredibly vulnerable and empowering lyric. Meanwhile, here comes Paul with that same childlike perspective, this time down the street of Penny Lane. It is a lyric straight out of a storybook, a series of observations, of passing imagery. As a listener, you can almost feel yourself strolling down the lane, turning your head as you go, looking by at the passing shops and patrons. There is a magic in the air, and yet, not everything is as it seems. A surreal veneer clings to this street. Behind the shelter in the middle of a roundabout, a pretty pretty nurse is selling poppies from a tray, and though she feels as if she's in a play, she is anyway. But this is simply the nature of things. Paul finds nothing but wonder and comfort in these observations. Present is none of John's insecurity, nor his defiance. Paul simply lets it wash over him, and all is well. It is a masterpiece for Paul, just as Strawberry Fields is for John. Two songs that are so alike, yet could hardly be more different. While most of the engineers worked on finalizing the mix for Strawberry Fields in the Studio 3 control room, Paul sat down in Studio 2 and went to work on Penny Lane. To start, he spent some time perfecting the distinctive piano backing for the song, recording 6 takes on a Steinway grand piano. The 6th and final take was the best, and Paul set to recording overdubs. He started first with another recording from the Steinway, this time fed through a Vox amplifier with a tremolo effect, to give it some movement, while Ringo simultaneously played tambourine. Paul then added a third piano part, using EMI's Mrs. Mills upright piano, while Ringo played drums, and another, unnamed Beatle, added more tambourine. Finally, he recorded some harmonium, also run through the Vox amplifier, and with that, work was done for the day. They would record vocals for Penny Lane the next afternoon, though these would end up scrapped, and before finalizing the mix for When I'm 64, Paul requested that the engineer speed the song up almost an entire semitone so as to keep it light and not too turgid. And using the magic of modern technology, we can hear what the song sounded like originally.
When I get older, losing my head. When I get older, losing my head.
So comes New Year's. 1967 will be a year like no other, and despite only recording 3 songs so far, the Beatles and their team could not be any more excited for their next project. There is something magical in the air, and everybody can feel it. The rest will have to wait till part 2. We enter 1967. On January 5th, the Beatles came into the studio to continue work on Paul's Penny Lane, and Paul would record his second attempt for the lead vocal on this day, with John contributing some backing.
And though she feels as if she's in a play, she is anyway. Suburban skies I sit and meanwhile back.
But this day is infamously known for a much different recording. A recording that is undoubtedly the most sought-after piece of Beatles' lost media. An experimental track titled The Carnival of Light. Let's get one thing straight here. This recording has been heard by a select few, all who, frankly, don't particularly care for it. In December of 1966, Paul commissioned the BEV Art Collective to paint one of his pianos. When it was finished, a member of the collective, David Vaughn, delivered it to his home, and on doing so, boldly, asked Paul if he would be able to contribute a song for the art collective's upcoming events, a 1,000,000-volt light and sound rave. Paul, who always leans toward agreeable, gave David a yes.
Who ever heard of a man driving a painting? Well, this is art on wheels, all right.
Now, Paul certainly considered himself to have some avant-garde inclinations, despite his reputation as the cute Beatle and his penchant for granny music. And it would be dismissive to say that he didn't, as Paul was the one who conceptualized and contributed the home sound recordings for Tomorrow Never Knows.
I brought in a bunch of tape loops in a little plastic bag that I'd done at home. And I just made a lot of little loops that I liked, and brought them all in, literally little pieces of loop tape, a little plastic bag. And we got them all on 8 or so machines, with everyone holding a loop and a pencil or a bit of a glass and stuff.
And his exposure to the swinging London art scene would help set the stage for Sgt. Pepper's A Day in the Life and the Beatles' evolution as musicians going forward. But this was not to be an experimental work rooted in intent, as more than anything, And Paul may dispute this today. It was a favor he probably shouldn't have agreed to. After recording the vocals for Penny Lane, Paul turned to the rest of the band and asked for 20 minutes of their time, telling them he had agreed to do this. He instructed them to, quote, "All I want you to do is just wander around all the stuff, bang it, shout, it doesn't need to make any sense. Hit a drum, then wander on to the piano, hit a few notes. Just wander around." But if you know the Beatles, you know that at the end of the day, they love making music, and they will take any excuse to get weird with it. Let's hear now from Jeff Emerick. It was a bit of nonsense, really, but everyone had fun doing it. Whenever the Beatles tried something really outrageous, George Martin would roll his eyes and mutter a clipped, "Oh my God," under his breath. Looking back, I guess that everyone was tripping his brains out that night, but we didn't know it then. When John started shouting "Barcelona" repeatedly in one of his goon-like voices, Phil and I were doubled over in laughter. The song was drenched in echo and feedback, with a significant amount of discordant percussion and strange vocal contributions, such as close-mic'd gasping, coughing, screaming, and the incorporation of short bursts of more traditional instrumentation, such as corny cinema organ and pub piano. That uttered and repeated phrase from John, "Barcelona," actually ended up being dropped into Revolution No. 9 the following year. In the years since, Paul has somewhat reclaimed this recording. He considers it an example of his experimental influence on the band, an influence which John has usually been credited. And while we're on the topic of Paul, it is time to finally dip our toes into a topic I have till now avoided, one sure to excite our more conspiracy-driven Beatles fans. Paul is dead. The story goes that sometime in September or November of 1966, Paul died in a car accident, and rather than reveal the horrific news to the public, Paul was secretly replaced. And depending on what version of the story you subscribe to, his replacement was either named William Campbell or Billy Shepherd. Now I'm going to come out and say it. I think this is all bogus. Fun bogus, sure, but bogus. The origins of this rumor are murky, but Beatles publicist Tony Barrows confirms he was first contacted about the rumor in late 1966. They could have initially stemmed from the far more rational, but false rumors surrounding the Beatles' potential breakup after their decision to stop touring. Or perhaps from Paul's extended vacation through Europe and then into Kenya, where he then returned with a significantly different look than the one he donned prior. But at this point, the rumors were extremely niche, and this narrative wouldn't really develop until later on. Well, today, on January 7th, another seed in the story would be planted, when Paul's car, driven by an assistant of art dealer and friend to the Beatles, Robert Fraser, was crashed. The driver's name was Mohammed Staibi. We're going to share the whole story here, just for fun. It's a salacious tale, and should be taken with an enormous grain of salt.
And he said, "Could you pass the salt and pepper?" I thought he said Sergeant Pepper.
It goes like this. Robert invited Mohammed to tag along to a get-together at Paul's home in London. The two enter his home, where Paul invites them to a back room, retrieving a large and heavy book and placing it upon a table. But the book isn't a book, it's a stash. He opens the front cover to reveal it wholly hollowed out and packed full of hash, cocaine, heroin, and acid. They are then joined by Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, and mutual hipster friend Christopher Gibbs, and the drug-taking promptly commences. Night falls, and the group, presumably high out of their minds, decide to, quote, make a weekender out of it, and take a drive out to Keith Richards' secluded mansion in West Wittering, Sussex. Initially, the whole group attempts to pack into Mick Jagger's Mini Cooper, which they are obviously unable to fit in, so Mohammed suggests they take a second car, to which Paul says, "Sure, you can drive my Mini Cooper," and follow behind. Mohammed claims in the article that he had driven Paul's Mini Cooper many times, and it seems that Mohammed may have been a bit of a hash gopher in his time around Paul, so Paul suggesting he drive his car was nothing crazy. So now here's where things get even stupider. Everyone is still high. They are now speeding down the road. Mohammed is struggling to keep up with the Mini Cooper ahead of him. Even worse, he realizes he is out of cigarettes. Mohammed now presents a hilarious series of happenings, which, even in the unlikely event they are actually true, are nonetheless entertaining. Distraught by his lack of tobacco, Mohammed speeds furiously to pull alongside Mick Jagger's Mini and gestures to the parallel car, somehow communicating that he is in need of cigarettes. Robert Fraser then miraculously throws several over into Mohammed's window. I would love to hear someone well-versed in physics describe how this is even possible. Apparently, on his departure from Paul's home, Mohammed had left about a foot-long section of seatbelt hanging out of the car's door, and it was dragging against the road as he drove. He slows down to light his cigarette, and as he does, another car passes, and according to Mohammed, the car somehow drives over the minuscule bit of dragging seatbelt, pulling his car quickly to the right. The car supposedly jerks violently and goes flying as it crashes into a light pole set into a pillar of concrete, splitting the car straight down the middle, leaving Mohammed unconscious and full of glass. But a few minutes later, he snaps back too. Mohammed, the dutiful assistant he is, thinks not of his dire health, but of the box of drugs he has stashed in the car. Mohammed, aware of the implications should the police find drugs in a car owned by a Beatle, hobbles toward the side of the highway, bleeding profusely, and chucks the box down the bank before returning to the wreckage and waiting for an ambulance. He's taken to the hospital and mended, and in the days following, according to Mohammed at least, he is not rewarded for his Herculean effort to dispose of the drugs, but lashed, accused of stealing the drugs, and chastised for crashing Paul's very expensive car. This is all an extremely long-winded way of saying that this was another drop of gasoline that has helped to fuel the Paul is dead conspiracy. And apparently, Paul had the energy to attend a costume party hosted by Georgie Fame the very next day, where he was joined by John, Ringo, and Jane Asher, and the Beatles in what must have been a desperate attempt to be cancelled by historians of the future, wore a set of costumes that are not at all controversial from a modern lens. John dressed as a priest, Paul as a Confederate general for some God-for-known reason, and Ringo donned a stereotype of Arab garb. Please note, these costumes are obviously in poor taste, but historical context is important. Jane Asher, for her part though, dressed as an angel. Now, the Beatles had come and recorded numerous overdubs for Penny Lane on Friday the 6th, but every single one of these ended up scrapped, so I won't bore you with the fine details. But on today, the 9th, a significant piece of the song was recorded, that being the brass and wind arrangement. The composition was a team effort between Paul and George Martin, as they worked, like so many times before and after, as speaker and translator. Paul began playing the piano, telling the musicians it's kind of confusing to what key it is, and sang a few melodies he envisioned for the arrangement. George Martin got to work translating, and then conducted the session musicians through the composition. The next day was composed of textural work for the track, little ideas that help round out the song's soundscape wonderfully, such as the ringing of tubular bells whenever the fireman is mentioned. Also recorded were backing harmonies for the instrumental break. With the piccolo trumpet solo still yet to be recorded, Paul was unsure at this point as to just what sound he wanted to fill that space. But the very next day, he found his answer. Sitting in his home, he turned on the television, tuning in to BBC Two program Masterwork, which today was airing a performance of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2 in F major by trumpet player David Mason. And Paul was apparently impressed enough to phone George Martin, who he had arranged a studio session with David Mason for the 17th of January.
So, David, Paul McCartney sees you playing the piccolo trumpet on telly. What happens then?
Well, I received a phone call the next day from George Martin. And George said, well, are you free on tomorrow? And can you come along to Abbey Road? And I said, yes. And we arranged it, and just as an afterthought, I said, oh, who's this for? He said, oh, it's the Beatles.
That night, John and Paul swung by the Bag O' Nails Club to once again watch Jimi Hendrix perform. If I didn't emphasize it enough the last video, let me say it again. The Beatles and the musical pantheon as a whole were in complete and utter amazement of Hendrix. Brian Epstein had been at work for some time now, arranging the next Beatles film, a task he was finding surprisingly difficult. Why so much emphasis on a Beatles movie anyway? Why do you think? Money, brand marketing, and money. First off, they were contractually obligated. Their signed contract with production company United Artists stipulated a third film. A Hard Day's Night and Help had both been huge financial successes, considering their respective budgets. And it was of extra importance to Brian Epstein, who, finding his duties significantly diminished due to the Beatles' decision to quit touring, was terribly anxious to continue to help the band flourish. Today, on the 12th, Brian Epstein believed that he had finally found the scriptwriter for the next Beatles film, as he asked British playwright Joe Orton if he was interested in the job. Orton was beloved in the London theatre scene, and in fact, Paul had helped finance one of his plays, Loot, which had premiered just a little over 3 months earlier. But Orton's job wasn't to write a brand new script, but to rewrite an already existing script, one penned by British playwright Owen Halder, named Shades of a Personality. Though very little is known about this script, the basic premise is summarized in a diary entry written by Orton a few days later. It read, like the idea, basically, it is that there aren't 4 young men, just 4 aspects of one man. Sounds dreary, but as I thought about it, I realized what wonderful opportunities it would give. After a few days' thought, it was decided Orton would write the script. On the morning of the 17th, the Daily Mail flew onto doorsteps and stacked onto newsstands. And, if not for one person, it is sure that the paper this day would have fallen into the pits of forgotten history like so many others.
So it had 2 stories. One was the Guinness child had killed himself in a car. That was the main headline story.
As I covered in part 1, Tara Brown tragically died on the 18th of December, 1966, and the Daily Mail ran the story the next day on the 19th. But on this day came a bit of follow-up, as it was decided that Tara Brown's mother, Nikki Brown, would attain custody of Tara's 2 young children, rather than their paternal mother.
On the next page was about 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire.
This is so typical of John, and a story that will be told many times, of his ability to glean from seemingly innocuous newspaper stories, or even adverts, this strange, universal resonance, imbuing into these pieces of media something far deeper than they present on their face. This is part of the magic of A Day in the Life. But we'll get into all of that in just a bit. Later in the day, Paul came into EMI Studios, as it was the day to record the last little bit of overdub for Penny Lane, the piccolo trumpet solo by David Mason. We will now read another wonderful bit of recollection from engineer Jeff Emmerich. I found myself carefully placing a microphone in front of Mason, who was himself quite famous in the classical world as the principal trumpeter for the prestigious Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. The only problem was that no music had been prepared for him to play. Instead, he had to sit there for hours while Paul hummed and sang the parts he was hearing in his head, George Martin writing the notes out by hand. By this point, it was a big deal to be asked to play on a Beatles session, and I suppose Mason felt that it was prudent to keep his countenance, though I am quite sure the lack of preparation tried his patience sorely. True professional that he was, Mason played it perfectly the first time through, including the extraordinarily demanding solo, which ended on a note that was almost impossibly high. It was, quite simply, the performance of his life. And everyone knew it, except, obviously, Paul. As the final note faded to silence, he reached for the talkback mic. "Nice one, David. Can we try another pass?" There was a long moment of silence. "Another pass?" The trumpeter looked up at the control room helplessly. He seemed lost for words. Finally, he said softly, "Look, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I just can't do it any better." Mason knew that he had nailed it, that he had played everything note perfect, and that it was a prodigious feat that he could not possibly top. Quickly, George Martin intervened and addressed Paul emphatically, one of the few times in recent weeks that I saw him assert his authority as producer. Good God, you can't possibly ask the man to do that again. It's fantastic. A dark cloud gathered over Paul's face. Even though the exchange was occurring in the privacy of the control room, out of earshot of Mason and the other Beatles, George's remark clearly embarrassed and angered him. It was the kind of scene I would not witness again until partway through the making of the White Album, when things were to build to an exploding point. For an uncomfortable moment, the producer and his headstrong young artist glared at each other. Finally, Paul returned to the talkback mic. Okay, thank you, David, you're free to go now. And I'd also like to share a funny bit of recollection from David Mason himself, which in some ways answers a question I too have had. If you look at photographs from the Beatles' recording sessions, especially during 1967, you will notice that without fail, they are dressed to the absolute nines. Which made me wonder, did they just dress that way because they knew a photographer would be coming in? Or did they always dress so fashionably? David recalls.
So I went along the next night and in walked these four, and I thought they were in fancy dress. So I said, have you just come off a film set? Oh no, mate, we always dress like this.
Who said that?
George Lennon. No, John Lennon. John Lennon. I didn't even know their names at that time. It was terrible.
So comes January 19th, the day that the Beatles began work on one of the most important pieces of popular music ever recorded. A Day in the Life. The working title was In the Life of... They first began rehearsals, which were recorded, but later wiped. After that, they got to work on the basic rhythm track. The song was still very sparse and bare. The brilliance of the piece was still very much evident, but the elements that would elevate the track from a masterpiece into something arguably even greater had not yet been conceptualized. Emmerich recalls, I remember thinking, Christ, John's topped himself. As Lennon sang softly, Paul accompanied him on piano. A lot of thought must have gone into the piano part, because it was providing a perfect counterpoint to John's vocal and guitar playing. Ringo joined on bongos, while George Harrison, who seemed to have been given nothing specific to do, idly shook a pair of maracas. Let's take a beat to discuss that last point there, because I believe it bears mentioning. George's contributions to Sgt. Pepper's were the least significant of any album the Beatles ever made. We'll discuss this much more later, but it was already a developing trend at this point, that George Harrison, musically at least, seemed to be somewhat checked out.
For me, it was kind of a bit tiring, or it was a bit boring because, I mean, I had a few moments in there that I enjoyed, but generally, I didn't really like that album much. My heart was still in India, you know. I mean, that was the big thing for me when it happened in the '66. It was after that, everything else seemed like hard work, you know. It was a job. It was like doing something I didn't really want to do. I was losing interest in being fab.
Emmerich continued. The song, as played during that first run-through, consisted simply of a short introduction, 3 verses, and 2 perfunctory choruses. The only lyric in the chorus was a rather daring, Obviously more was needed to flesh it out, but this was all Lennon had written. There was a great deal of discussion about what to do, but no real resolution. Paul thought he might have something that would fit, but for the moment, everyone was keen to start recording. So it was decided simply to leave 24 empty bars in the middle as a kind of placeholder. The song was clearly unfinished, but it was so good nonetheless that it was decided to plow ahead and get it down on tape and then finish it later. In essence, the composition was going to be structured during the recording stage. It was now time for overdubs, most importantly, John's lead vocal. His guide vocal had been splendid, but had been just that, a guide. It was time for the real thing. And the engineers, despite being so accustomed to hearing the Beatles and John on their A-game, were absolutely blown away. Once John started singing, we were all stunned into silence. The raw emotion in his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Lennon did take after take of the lead vocal, each heavily laden with tape echo, each more amazing than the one before.
I read the news today, oh boy.
His vocal performance that night was an absolute tour de force, and it was all George Martin, Phil, and I could talk about long after the session ended.
I saw the photograph.
The boys kept at it. They had too much momentum to step away. We'll hear now from George Martin. John asked Paul if he had anything to go in the middle part of the song, and Paul came up with Woke Up, Got Out of Bed, which is really a completely different song, but it merged into the other one because it provided a sort of dream sequence.
He stuck it on now. Instead of going on and developing that lick into the middle eight, which we would normally do, we got into how about putting a whole different song which he already had that had nothing to do with Day in the Life, and putting those two beats, which is a precursor to Abbey Road style later on.
We divided the two sections with what was in effect a very long musical pause. When we recorded the original track, it was just Paul banging away on the same piano note, bar after bar, for 24 bars. In order to keep time, we got Mal Evans to count each bar, and on the record you can still hear his voice as he stood by the piano counting. For a joke, Mal set an alarm clock to go off at the end of 24 bars. And you can hear that too. We left it in because we couldn't get it off. And in a stroke of serendipity, this groundbreaking session just happened to be attended by French photographer Jean-Marie Perrier, who after the session took the photo that was used on the Beatles' next single.
Strawberry fields forever.
On Saturday, Paul attended a party hosted by folk singer Julie Felix, celebrating the release of her new single, Saturday Night, which had been written by Donovan. And the reason I bring it up is because Julie Felix is just one of the many countless affairs that Paul had participated in while in a relationship with Jane Asher. This particular one having occurred sometime in 1966. It's time to circle back to the script for the next Beatles movie, and thanks to the incredibly detailed diary taking of our writer, Joe Orton, we can paint the next bit of tale here very well. Be warned, it's another rambling tangent, but I will always relish the chance to get to explore some Beatles lore that isn't well known. Joe had received a call from Brian Epstein on the 23rd of January, asking him if he could commit to a meeting with the boys the next day. He agreed, so Joe walked into Brian's office the next day at 4:45, intent on meeting the Beatles. Well, when he arrives, he is greeted by Brian's assistant, Peter Brown, who Joe describes as a youngish man with a hairstyle which was way out in 1958. Peter Brown tells Joe that, whoops, sorry, the boys are busy. Can we make another appointment? And Joe, as we are about to learn, is a real character, and no pushover either. His response to Peter Brown was, as written in his diary, "What guarantee is there that you won't break that?" I said, "I think you'd better find yourself a different writer." He asked me to wait a minute and went away to return with Brian Epstein himself. Somehow, I'd expected something like Michael Codron. I'd imagine Epstein to be florid, Jewish, dark-haired, and overbearing. Instead, I was face to face with a mousy-haired, slight young man, washed out in a way. I went into his office. "Could you meet Paul and me for dinner tonight?" he said. "We do want to have the pleasure of talking to you." I replied, by now sulky and unhelpful. "Could I send a car to fetch you after the show?" I didn't much relish the idea, but agreed, and after a lot of polite flim-flammery, left, almost tripping over the carpet and crashing into the secretary, who gave a squeal of surprise as I hurtled past her. At 8 o'clock, Joe arrived at Brian's home. He was let in by a butler, and then was greeted by Paul, who, according to Joe, looked just as the photographs, only he'd grown a mustache. He was playing the latest Beatles recording, Penny Lane. I liked it very much. Then he played the other side, Strawberry something. I didn't like this as much. The meeting turned out to be hardly that. Rather, Paul and Joe sat around and chatted for a bit about the theater, about drugs, before, inexplicably, the entirety of the Easy Beats rolled up, who Joe, as a gay man, took a liking to, and eloquently described talking to the lead Mercy Beat as making him feel like an Edwardian masher with a Gaiety girl. Only you, Joe. Before he left, Joe convened with Paul, where he told him, quote, "I had a last word with Paul. Well, I said, I'd like to do the film. There's only one thing we've got to fix up. You mean the bread?" Yes. We smiled and parted. It's now the 28th of January, and it is finally the night of the 1,000,000-volt Light and Sound Rave. The posters for the event advertised music composed by Paul McCartney and Unit Delta Plus, the latter being an electronic music group.
Well, the first stage in the realization of a piece of music is to construct the individual sounds that we're going to use.
Which they are all very cool in their own right, though it was puzzling that they received the top billing, considering that also performing was both Soft Machine and Jimi Hendrix. Of course, the music composed by Paul for this event is the elusive Carnival of Light. And just how will this piece of avant-garde composition land had Paul, by instructing the Beatles to wander around the room and bang on various instruments, managed to create a subversive masterpiece? Well, no. Definitely not. Despite being music delivered from the Beatles themselves, no one at the event had much good to say about it, if they could even remember it at all. David Allen of Soft Machine would recall, "I dimly remember the sound collage because it was not particularly memorable. Frankly, the whole situation was a mess. Paul, on delivering the tape to event organizer David Vaughn, had either inadvertently or out of laziness left at the back end of the tape a demo recording of Fixing a Hole, which, on completion of the 15-minute long Carnival of Light, played before the entirety of the crowd, which angered Paul greatly. To add to all of this, from all of my reading, David Vaughn, the one who initially came to Paul, is a bit of a prick. So all the music was live, apart from these fucking awful tapes that Paul McCartney did. You know, where he thought he'd do something without words. He just proffered his services, and that's what we got. I can't remember, but I don't think it was up to much. It didn't last with me. If you dig, you'll continue to find more quotes from David, lamenting the fact that Paul clearly phoned in the piece. But when you ask one of the most famous musicians on the planet if they'll contribute music for free for your event, and they agree, it's probably wiser to show a little tact, even if you were disappointed. He did show a little bit of self-awareness later in life, recalling, "I asked Paul to do it, and I thought he would make more of it than he did. I thought this was a vehicle for him, if anything was. My trouble is, I expect everybody to drop everything. I forget other people have got things going on." Besides the disappointment of Carnival of Light, the event was a smashing success, as Hendrix alone drew a crowd of about 2,000 for his performance. It was now time to begin recording on the album's titular track, a unique and rocking introduction to the entire concept behind the album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In part 1, I shared the story behind the name itself, which was in one part parody of a new trend in band names, as summarized here by John. The whole West Coast long-name group thing was coming in. When people were no longer called the Beatles or the Crickets, they were suddenly called Fred and his incredible shrinking Grateful Airplanes. And the other part was composed of a happy accident involving Paul and Mal Evans.
I was on a plane with our roadie and we were eating, and he said, "Could you pass the salt and pepper?" And I thought he said Sgt. Pepper.
Speaking of Mal Evans, it's time we talk about his relationship with Paul during this period. Mal Evans had served as the band's roadie for some years now, and was incredibly loyal. But once the band quit touring, he more or less became Paul's personal roadie / bodyguard / gopher. He accompanied Paul wherever he went, and what you'll notice as you go along is that there are lots of little bits and pieces of ideas influenced by Mal. I want to share the following quote from Mal, a quote that seems slightly dubious, but also potentially very revealing. Mal would write, "I stayed with Paul for 4 months, and he had a music room at the top of his house with a multicolored piano, and we were up there a lot of the time. We wrote Sgt. Pepper, and also another song in the album, Fixing a Hole. When the album came out, I remember it very clearly. We were driving somewhere late at night. There was Paul, and Paul turned round to me and said, 'Look, Mal, do you mind if we don't put your name on the songs? You'll get your royalties and all that, because Lennon and McCartney are the biggest things in our lives. We are a really hot item, and I don't want to make it Lennon-McCartney-Evans, so would you mind? I didn't mind, because I was so in love with the group that it didn't matter to me. I knew myself what had happened. So let's unpack this. If you've watched Get Back and Mal's difficulty in timing the hitting of an anvil,
On a head, clang, clang, Maxwell Silver.
you'll know he's no musician. Paul wrote the music, the melodies, this much is very clear. But what Mal's quote implies is that he, occasionally it seems, was an active and engaged participant in lyric and song ideas. More so, and more importantly, if Mal was honest in his recollection here, which, who's to know, it means Paul personally acknowledged that Mal contributed enough to the songs to potentially warrant a songwriting credit. I'm pretty split here. The supposed quote Mal shared seems very strange, and frankly, a bit awkward. The crediting of half a dozen songwriters and producers for a track is a more recent invention. And while it may have been nice to throw a bone here and there, with the way that royalties were structured in this period, at least in the Beatles' publishing contracts, the crediting of a whole additional writer for some ideas would have been out of proportion to their contribution. This practice was not at all contained to the Beatles.
Tell me, Sister Murphy.
And still occurs constantly today. The Beatles, unbelievably, rolled into the studio at a bright and early 7 a.m., and they would stay there until 2:30 a.m. the next day. This session marked a change in the boys' engineering team, as second engineer Phil McDonald was promoted, and taking his place was Richard Lush. The following account was shared by Jeff Emmerich. Richard's first encounter with Paul was particularly memorable, though it occurred when both George Martin and I were out of the room. He was sitting by the tape machine, fiddling with one of the controls when Paul wandered in. "Hello, who are you?" he asked. "I don't remember seeing you here before." Paul was asking the question in a good-natured way, but Richard detected an undertone of suspicion, too. Phil had already warned him that the Beatles did not like seeing unfamiliar faces at their sessions. Without anyone around to vouch for him, he nervously stammered a reply. My name is Richard. I'm a button pusher here." Paul immediately strode across the room and got right in Richard's face. "Oh yeah?" he sneered, assuming a pugilistic stance, both fists at the ready. "Want to fight?" Needless to say, this very nearly caused Richard to have an unfortunate accident, one that would certainly have become studio lore had he not quickly recovered and realized that Paul's challenge to his manhood was really just a joke, just an example of Liverpudlian humor. All four Beatles were pranksters at heart. They enjoyed doing the unexpected just to see what kind of reaction they could get out of the unwary. The boys got to work, although there was one surprise right away. Paul had decided that he wanted to play rhythm guitar on the recording, as according to Emmerich, he simply told John, "Let me do the rhythm on this. I know exactly what I want." John accepted Paul's instruction without a word of protest and simply picked up a bass guitar. He didn't have any feel for the instrument though, so we decided to record him on a separate track, using a DI box instead of a bass amp. This way, his guide bass part could be replaced later by Paul without any problem of bleed or leakage onto any of the microphones. And that was exactly what happened. They recorded 9 tracks of rhythm, the final of which was declared the best, and Paul himself would overdub the bass line he desired. And with that, we've come to the end of part 2. It is February 10th, 1967. Inside the vast space of EMI's Studio 2 is a scene like something straight out of Alice in Wonderland. A mass of colorfully adorned individuals float about the studio, the pantheon of British pop stardom, leading figures of the psychedelic movement, and of course, the Beatles. In the center of the room sits an orchestra, and not just any orchestra, but some of the most esteemed classical musicians in Britain. And as they rehearse, the Beatles greet them, handing them bald caps, clown wigs, rubber noses, gorilla paws, and clip-on nipples. It is a bizarre, spectacular sight. Slowly but surely, the crowd disperses, and the studio grows quiet. The Beatles' producer, George Martin, takes a deep breath and then counts the musicians in. The sound is strange, a controlled cacophony, at first just quietly stirring, but slowly it begins to build, filling the space, an anxious, almost frightening sound that grows louder and 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 louder until, as the end of January neared, Brian Epstein was subjected to continual pressure from the Beatles record company, EMI, to release a new single. It had been around 5 months since Revolver had released, and that the Beatles had decided to quit touring, as clearly demonstrated by the flurry of newspaper rumors of their dissolution. The general public, and the higher-ups as well, were all anxiously awaiting the Beatles' next move. So Brian Epstein consulted with George Martin, who told Brian that the Beatles had 2 songs just about ready, 2 songs that he considered the best they had made yet: Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. So that part was all good and well. The next step was to shoot some promotional film for the songs, something the Beatles had done before, starting in 1965. The boys were filmed miming to 4 different songs: I Feel Fine, Ticket to Ride, Day Tripper, and We Can Work It Out. Then, in 1966, the Beatles filmed with a familiar name, that being Michael Lindsay Hogg, who would go on to direct the Let It Be documentary. These again were simple films, composed entirely of the Beatles miming to the songs, although Paperback Writer was at least more visually interesting, being filmed in the garden of the historic Chiswick House, rather than studios like all the others. But the promotional films for Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane were to be an entirely different breed, composed not of simple miming, but of dynamic imagery. And this unique pivot was of course prompted by the Beatles themselves, full to the brim with creative innovation, right? Well, surprisingly, no. Time for a quick flashback. Top of the Pops was a BBC program that began in 1964 and, simply put, was a showcase of the most popular music any given week. The band or artist would be invited into the studio to perform the song, and, almost always, they would mime. But why? First off, the television studio was not created to accommodate live music, or at the very least, was not ideal for it. Secondly, why risk a televised blunder or mistake when you can simply mime along? It was just a promotional tool, after all. Well, some people took issue with this. The majority of working musicians made their money off of live performances or working as hired session musicians, 2 positions that had their value diminished by these pseudo-performances. The Musicians' Union came together and decided that mimed performances would be banned. Brian Epstein phoned Swedish director Peter Goldman for the job, and he promptly flew into the UK. My first meeting with the group was at Ringo's house. He was very kind and took me for a walk in his garden with his wife Maureen, and their little white poodle, Tiger. I got my boots all muddy, and Ringo insisted on giving me another pair to replace them. That is really typical of him. I was amazed to find that there was a ban in Britain which prevented the Beatles from miming to their record. So I had to find settings and ideas which were sympathetic to their songs without turning them into comic actors. On January 30th, they began filming on the grounds of the historic Knoll House, picked specifically due to the dead oak tree that resided there. The strange fantasy instrument hung up in the tree was the idea of Klaus Voormann, longtime friend to the Beatles, and the artist behind the Revolver album cover. They took a piano and tore it apart, reconfiguring it into what we see in the film. Just as they began, a strong gust of wind swept through, disconnecting the piano wires they had painstakingly connected to the tree's large branch. Oh well, they redid it, and from there, the shoot was mostly improvised. Goldman utilized a number of experimental techniques, such as the dramatic and fantastic fantastical lighting, and sequences filmed in reverse or with the camera running at a faster or slower than usual speed. They finished for the day and planned to reconvene on February 7th to shoot film for the single's second A-side, Penny Lane.
We're Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
The day before, the Beatles recorded the rhythm track for Sgt. Pepper's, and it was a very Paul-heavy recording, as he not only overdubbed the bass track, but also played rhythm guitar, a role usually occupied by John. This is a trend we will continue to see develop. While John's songs usually arrived to the studio a little less developed, and thus were more collaborative during the recording process, Paul almost always had the song fleshed out in his head, and so would often approach the recording process as a director, more than a collaborator. And while there is not necessarily anything wrong with this, Beatles fans will know that over time, this began to wear on the rest of the boys.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, whatever you want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it.
To be recorded on this day was Paul's lead vocal for the track.
They've been going in and out of style, but they're guaranteed to raise a smile.
And then the backing vocals. Mal Evans' diary entry from this day would read, recording voices on Captain Pepper, all 6 of us doing the chorus in the middle. So it appears that along with the trio of John, Paul, and George, that Ringo and studio staples Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall all contributed to the chorus's backing.
You're such a lovely audience, we'd like to take you home with us, we'd love to take you home.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head.
Part of what makes the Beatles' studio years so remarkable was how specifically they approached each aspect of the recording process. In their earlier years, everything was fairly boilerplate. Of course, it was wonderfully composed and arranged, thanks not only to the Beatles' talent, but the remarkable engineering prowess of George Martin. But the songs and sounds were simple, the recording process straightforward. Moving into Help and then Rubber Soul, there was a distinct shift in the guitar tones utilized by the boys. Influenced in no small way by groups like the Byrds.
The reason why, I can say.
Paul's Yesterday, of course, marked the first time that a Beatles arrangement was almost entirely orchestral. Norwegian Wood introduced an instrument to the Western world that would come to define the psychedelic period. Then we arrive at Revolver. There is no more obvious example than that of Tomorrow Never Knows, a song which shifted the popular music landscape significantly. But tracks like Eleanor Rigby and For No One sound almost of an entirely new genre. The guitar utilized throughout Revolver, with its extreme amount of treble, lends the whole album a unique, druggy feel. All of this amounts to my incredibly long-winded introduction to today's recording session. The first task of the day was re-recording Paul's lead vocal for the middle section of A Day in the Life, as Paul had decided that he wanted his voice to have a unique, sleepy-sounding quality, as recalled by Jeff Emmerich. He explained that he wanted his voice to sound all muzzy, as if he had just woken up from a deep sleep and hadn't yet gotten his bearings, because that was what the lyric was trying to convey. My way of achieving that was to deliberately remove a lot of the treble from his voice and heavily compress it to make him sound muffled.
Found my way downstairs and drank a cup.
Found the way downstairs and drank a cup.
When the song goes into the next section, the dreamy section that John sings, the full fidelity is restored. Due to the limitations of the 4-track recording process, Paul's vocal was recorded onto the same track as John's vocal, making it incredibly important that Paul's vocal dropped out before cutting off any of John's. And the Beatles' newly appointed second engineer, Richard Lush, actually took the initiative to ensure this, speaking to Paul from the control room's talkback mic, stressing the importance of his vocal ending at just the right point. And if you listen closely, you can hear, ever so slightly, Paul rushing his last line.
And somebody spoke and I went into a dream.
Which brings us to our first mystery of the video, if you can call it that. There has been some debate as to who really sings the ahs leading into the next section of the song. On first listen, it is distinctly John, but some, myself included, hear several inflections throughout the vocal that sound far more Paul than John. If you take Jeff Emmerich's word for it, the vocal is John's, case closed. That is what he recalls, and though memory is unreliable, he was incredibly involved in the recording process. But still, a seed of doubt lingers. In a Reddit, Ask Me Anything, with Paul McCartney from 4 years back, he himself recalled that. I seem to remember we all sang it, but I was definitely in there. We now returned our attention to the main section of the song. At that point, the rhythm still consisted solely of Ringo's maracas and just the slightest trace of George Harrison on bongos. Editor's note here. Prior studio notes indicate that it was Ringo on bongos and George on maracas. And John felt strongly that more was needed. Paul suggested that Ringo not just do his normal turn, but really cut loose on the track. And I could see that the drummer was quite reticent. Come on, Paul. You know how much I hate flashy drumming. But with John and Paul coaching and egging him on, he did an overdub that was nothing short of spectacular, featuring a whole series of quirky tom-tom fills. Emmerich would take the lead in sculpting the drum's distinctive sound for the recording. We were looking for a thicker, more tonal quality, so I suggested that Ringo tune his toms really low, making the skins really slack, and I also added a lot of low end at the mixing console. This, combined with a number of creative miking choices on Ringo's drum set, are what resulted in one of the more remarkable percussive recordings on a Beatles song. And now, finally, we come to the point of inception, the idea that would turn the track into something wholly unique, that being the utilization of a symphony orchestra to fill the 24 bars that still remained empty before John and Paul's segments of the song. And from the jump, the Beatles knew that they wanted something beyond a typical arrangement. John had an idea, abstract as usual, about creating some kind of sound that would start out really tiny and then gradually expand to become huge and all-engulfing. What I'd like to hear is a tremendous build-up from nothing up to something absolutely like the end of the world. Picking up on the theme, Paul excitedly suggested employing a full symphony orchestra. George Martin liked the idea, but, mindful of the cost, was adamant that there was no way he could justify charging EMI for a full 90-piece orchestra just to play 24 bars of music. It was Ringo, of all people, who came up with the solution. Well then, he joked, let's just hire half an orchestra and have them play it twice. Everyone did a double take, stunned by the simplicity. Or was it simple-mindedness? You know, Ring, that's not a bad idea, Paul said. But still, boys, think of the cost. George Martin stammered. Lennon put an end to the discussion. Right, Henry, his voice carrying the tone of an emperor issuing a decree. Enough chit-chat, let's do it. It was decided. George Martin would book the orchestra for a session on the 10th. All that was left to figure out was exactly what sound they wanted to produce. We come to February 7th, and it was now time to film the promo for Penny Lane. With the single slated to release on the 11th, there was no time to waste. Goldman had dreamed up the idea of bringing in horses during his plane ride over. The end result was fantastic, although was easier said than done, as according to Goldman, the horses we got for the Penny Lane clip proved to be spirited, and when the Beatles got off them, they just bolted. It took us a couple of hours to recapture them from the far side of the park. Later in the day, the drummer of the Monkees, Mickey Dolenz, was invited to Paul McCartney's home. At this point in time, the Monkees were beginning to occupy the fanatical teeny bop niche the Beatles used to have a stranglehold upon, before they turned druggy, strange, and grew distasteful mustaches.
Everyone we meet.
It seems this may have been a little bit of guerrilla marketing for the Monkees themselves, and the meeting was possibly arranged by Don Short, who wrote the initial article detailing this meetup in the Daily Mirror. Avid Beatles fans will recognize Don as the journalist who accompanied the Beatles throughout their tours, and Don, as a friend, or at the very least, an acquaintance, of Paul, could easily have phoned him and asked for the favor. Mickey would later say, "Paul is a beautiful guy. His mustache knocked me out. I may grow one like that someday, and he wore the most fantastic tie. Originally, the whole thing was a setup as a publicity thing, and although I didn't dig that idea, I was really pleased that it worked out so well, and that we seemed to get on well together." Paul would invite Mickey to attend the Beatles recording session scheduled for the next day. Unsurprisingly, John's "Good morning, good morning" was apparently inspired by an advertisement, that being a Kellogg's commercial that came on the television while he was writing.
Good morning, the best to you each morning. Sunshine breakfast, Kellogg's cornflakes, crisp and full of sun.
Maureen loves Kellogg's.
Good Morning is often considered one of the weaker tracks on Pepper, but personally, I really enjoy it. John very accurately captures that sense of day-to-day ennui and angst. It's not a sad song, but it's not a happy one either. It's frustrated. According to Paul, John was feeling trapped in suburbia, and he was going through some problems with Cynthia. It was about his boring life at the time. There's a reference in the lyrics to Meet the Wife. There was an afternoon TV soap called Meet the Wife that John watched. He was that bored. The Beatles recorded 8 takes of backing, with Paul, who intended on overdubbing the bass line later, assisted Ringo by playing his floor tom in the recordings. During the midst of all this was when Mickey Dolenz rolled into the studio. I thought it was going to be some kind of crazy Beatlemania fun fest, and I got totally dressed up for it. I had tie-dye underwear and paisley bell-bottoms, and my hair was up in curlers, and I think I had the linen glasses, and I'm 6 sheets to the wind again, of course. And I walk in and it looks like my high school gymnasium. There was fluorescent lighting, nobody there but the 4 guys sitting in little folding chairs, and Ringo behind the kit. And I'm like, where are the girls? I must have looked like such an idiot. I looked like a cross between Ronald McDonald and Charlie Manson.
We'll have to try it. Yeah, try and make it.
Much to Paul's chagrin, EMI Studios was booked up for the day, and while they would typically attempt to move heaven and earth to accommodate the Beatles, there was nothing that could be done on this day. But Paul was absolutely itching to begin recording on a track of his, so the Beatles would head into Regent Sound Studio. Paul must have had Fixing a Hole banging around since early January. As in last video, I brought up the fact that Paul had accidentally left a demo recording of the song at the end of the mysterious Lost Beatles recording, The Carnival of Light, that was played at the Million Volt Light and Sound Rave. Fixing a Hole is one of the songs that Mal Evans claims he contributed lyrics to. This could very well be the case, but I was unable to find any specifics on this. Based solely on the image and connotation that Fixing a Hole conjures, there was speculation as to whether this song was a heroin metaphor. But, as we all know, Paul's heart was wholly devoted to marijuana. While Paul does not bear the reputation of being a quote-unquote stoner musician, it is undeniably true that he absolutely adored pot. As he put it in his other ode to the drug, Got to Get You Into My Life. Just as Paul was about to leave to head to the recording session, a man walked up to his gate.
And the craziest story about it was the evening we were going to have the session. The session was booked, and I was getting ready to go out to the session, and a guy knocked on my door in London. And at that time, I was living on my own, kind of with my bachelor pad in London, you know, so everyone always came around. It was the place to hang out. You could always come to Paul's. It was like any time of the night, you could always crash there. Anyway, this guy comes to the door, and I said, yeah, I didn't recognize him. I said, who are you? He said, I'm Jesus. So I just kind of looked at him. I said, well, you better come in then. You know, what are you going to do? So I got the kettle on. I said, you want a cup of tea? I thought, well, you know, got to treat him right. You never know, you know, you just... So it was fine, and I was chatting away, and he seemed like a great bloke and that. So I said, do you want to come to a session? He said, yeah. I said, you'll have to be very quiet and just sit in a corner, though. I said, I don't want to upset everyone, you know. And Lord knows what they're going to think, you know. So I went around, I just sort of said, this guy, he says he's Jesus, you know. I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances. Is it okay if he sits in the corner? So he sat there for the session on Fixing the Hole. We just made the record, said good night. I've never seen him since.
Paul knew exactly what he wanted for the song, and so it was banged out very quickly. George Martin accompanied them to the session, but Jeff Emmerich, contractually obligated to EMI Studios, was not able to. The rhythm track was incredibly simple, composed only of harpsichord, percussion, and bass. The bass was the driving force for the rhythm, so Paul played it with the band, rather than overdubbing. However, this did create a little quirk. Typically, Paul would play the keys on a track, as he had the most feel for the instrument compared to John or George. But seeing as he was playing bass here, good old talented and reliable George Martin would take over the harpsichord for this recording. The first take of the rhythm was satisfactory, so they then began overdubbing, which again was very simple. Paul recorded lead vocals, double tracking them.
I'm fixing a hole where the rain gets in and stops my mind from wandering where it will go.
With John joining Paul on backing harmonies. George would then overdub an excellent and very characteristically Harrison guitar solo to polish it off. In the days since the recording work on A Day in the Life on the 3rd of February, the Beatles had been in constant contact with George Martin, figuring out how to bring their concept of, quote, some kind of sound that would start out really tiny and then gradually expand to become huge and all-engulfing to fruition. For the Beatles, it was as simple as that. Book the orchestra, make it happen. I think it would be great if we ask each member of the orchestra to play randomly, Paul suggested. George Martin was aghast. Randomly? That will just sound like a cacophony. It's pointless. Okay, well then, not completely randomly, Paul replied. Maybe we could get each of them to do a slow climb from the lowest note their instrument can play up to the highest note. Yeah, interjected John, but George Martin was far more aware of the realities of working with professional session musicians. Come on, John, I said. There's no way you can get a symphony orchestra sitting around and say to them, look, fellers, this is what you're going to do. Because you won't get them to do what you want them to do. You've got to write something down for them. It was once again time for George Martin to demonstrate his brilliance and his ability to bring the Beatles' ideas to life. For the I'd like to turn you on bit, I used cellos and violas. I had them playing those two notes that echoed John's voice. However, instead of fingering their instruments, which would produce crisp notes, I got them to slide their fingers up and down the frets, building in intensity until the start of the orchestral climax. That climax was something else again. What I did there was to write, at the beginning of the 24 bars, the lowest possible note for each of the instruments in the orchestra. At the end of the 24 bars, I wrote the highest note each instrument could reach that was near a chord of E major. The musicians also had instructions to slide as gracefully as possible between one note and the next. In the case of stringed instruments, that was a matter of sliding their fingers up the strings. With keyed instruments, like clarinet and oboe, they obviously had to move their fingers from key to key as they went up, but they were asked to lip the changes as much as possible too. Everyone was to start as quietly as possible, almost inaudibly, and end in a, metaphorically, lung-bursting tumult. And in addition to this extraordinary of musical gymnastics, I told them that they were to disobey the most fundamental rule of orchestra, They were not to listen to their neighbors. A well-schooled orchestra plays, ideally, like one man. Following the leader, I emphasized that this was exactly what they must not do. I told them, I want everyone to be individual. It's every man for himself. Don't listen to the fellow next to you. If he's a third away from you, and you think he's going too fast, let him go. Just do your own slide up, your own way. Needless to say, they were amazed. They had certainly never been told that before. It was going to be a huge day, but the Beatles, being the Beatles, decided that it should be even bigger. The following account was shared by Jeff Emmerich. A little later that evening, Paul had another brainstorm. Let's make the session more than just a session. Let's make it a happening. Lennon loved the idea. We'll invite all our friends, and everyone will have to come in fancy dress costume. George Martin smiled paternally. Well, I can certainly ask the orchestra to wear their tuxedos, though there may be an extra cost involved. Sod the cost, John said. We're making enough bloody money for EMI that they can spring for it. And for the party favors, too. To gales of laughter from the others, Lennon began reeling off a list of what he wanted Mal to purchase at the novelty store. Silly hats, rubber noses, clown wigs, bald head pates, gorilla paws, and lots of clip-on nipples. When the big day finally came, the session had indeed become a spectacle. Attending were Patty Harrison, Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, Keith Richards, Donovan, and a host of others. To get the orchestra in the mood for this very atypical day of work, the Beatles set about the studio handing out the silly props they had Mal purchase. When I went back into the studio, the sight was unbelievable. The orchestra leader, David McCallum, who used to be the leader of the Royal Philharmonic, was sitting there in a bright red false nose. He looked up at me through paper glasses. Eric Grunenberg, now a soloist and once leader of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, was playing happily away, his left hand perfectly normal on the strings of his violin, but his bow held in a giant gorilla's paw. The orchestra, of course, thought it was all a stupid giggle and a waste of money. But I think they were carried into the spirit of the party just because it was so ludicrous. Work began by allocating the Beatles' rhythm track onto one 4-track machine and setting up the orchestra to record on another, separate machine. Then it began. They recorded one go on a track, then they went again and recorded onto another track, until they filled all 4 tracks. Essentially, they had taken the effect the orchestra created and quadrupled it. All the while, the spectacle was filmed by Beatles publicist Tody Bramwell, with the idea to utilize the footage for a TV special. However, this never materialized, as the song would be banned by the BBC on release due to it containing drug references, which the Beatles would coyly deny.
We sort of said, I'd love to turn you on. And we looked at each other and think we know what we're doing here, don't we? We're actually saying for the first time ever, words like turn you on, And
when the session musicians finished their work and left, the Beatles set right back to their work. They felt that the orchestral climax brought the song to too abrupt an ending. An idea was floated, a sustained hum of the final chord. Jeff Emmerich wrote that it was Paul's idea, while George Martin's recollection paints it as his. The song needed bringing sharply back down to earth. What we required, I thought, was a simple yet stunning chord, something very, very loud, very resonant. But what would give us that resonance? I had always thought that the sound of a lot of people chanting a mantra was impelling and hypnotic. Why don't we make a chord of people singing? Get them to sing all the basic notes and track them over and over and over again. The remaining guest gathered around a microphone and gave it several goes at humming and sustaining that final, powerful note. The effect, frankly, was somewhat pathetic.
A Day in the Life. This is take 8 and it's the choir for the end. Choir?
You lead it.
Come on, we'll all subconsciously
Follow the leader.
What's the note then, girl? Shall we just all check? Take 9.
As George Martin would later put it, if I had 4,000 people available to sing, it might have worked. Everyone in the building was dead tired. It had been a tremendous, exciting, and unbelievably expensive day of work, but it was worth it. The Beatles, their engineering team, and the orchestra had produced a sound like never before heard in a pop recording. On February 13th, the double A side of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane would be released, and perhaps the world wasn't quite ready for the new sound they presented. In Britain, it was the first Beatles single since Please Please Me in 1963 to fail to reach number 1 on the UK singles chart. The single was held, hilariously, at number 2 behind Engelbert Humperdinck's Release Me. But really, this was due to an asinine technicality, a chart protocol, whereby only the sales of the best-selling side of a double A side were eligible, and so the record's overall sales were effectively halved. In reality, the double A side sold considerably more than Humperdinck's Release Me. While the songs may have taken a moment to be processed by the public, there was one individual who was immediately shell-shocked. With the release of Rubber Soul in 1965, the Beatles secured their position as the most innovative group in pop music. But for the first time ever, in May of 1966, they were challenged, possibly even topped. The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds was a landmark achievement, a culmination of pop music's innovation in the period. Its impact on the Beatles helped drive their desire to once more up their game on Revolver, which, on Revolver's release, then drove the Beach Boys, specifically Brian Wilson, to innovate even more. They began work on their response, Smile, which was dreamed up to be a hybrid of their already established pop perfection and of the avant-garde. But due to issues with their record label, Capitol, and more so, Brian Wilson's perfectionism, the record continuously became stuck in the mud. When driving one day in February, listening to the radio, his body full of an array of substances, Brian Wilson heard it. Strawberry Fields Forever began to play. Brian pulled over his car and began to cry, lamenting to himself that the Beatles had, quote, got there first. On the same day as the single's release, the Beatles once more came into the studio. George Harrison was frustrated, spiritually, musically, financially. In September of 1966, he and Patty had flown to Bombay, an experience which was revelatory for George. He felt there what he had been missing back home. His heart was in India. He no longer desired to just be one of the boys. While George's talent as a songwriter undeniably continued to progress, at this time he was still not half the force of John and Paul. And while he still continued to contribute some very good tracks, for every one good one he brought in 2 or 3 that the Beatles and George Martin didn't consider up to snuff. That's not to say that John and Paul didn't perhaps overlook a song now and then. George apparently had written Isn't It a Pity back during Revolver, which is a beautiful track. Then we get to The Bread. The Beatles, financially, were not a monolith. The songwriting label of Lennon-McCartney dominated the Beatles' output, and thus, those two received the most money. To add to this, their songwriting contracts were separate entities. Lennon-McCartney received a larger percentage of royalties on their songwriting credits than George did for his. This was all distributed through their publishing contract with Northern Songs. So you probably now know where this is going. The song George arrived with today was titled Only a Northern Song. And no one, not John, certainly not George Martin or Jeff Emerick, not even George Harrison himself, was impressed with the track. Emerick would later say, his first attempt at contributing a song to the Sgt. Pepper album was a weak track that we all winced at. and it had minimal musical content that seemed to go nowhere. And to add to the misery, George Martin would recall the following. When George brought a new song along to me, even before he played it, I would say to myself, I wonder if it is going to be any better than the last one. It was in this light that I looked at the first number he brought for me for the Sgt. Pepper album. I groaned inside when I heard it. I had to tell George that as far as Pepper was concerned, I did not think his song would be good enough for what was shaping up as a really strong album. I suggested he come up with something a bit better. This tough love may have been needed. The next song George would bring forward would not be marginally, but significantly stronger, and one I consider to be one of the Beatles' most underrated.
Nothing to do to save his life, call his wife in.
Good Morning received just a couple of overdubs today, that being John's lead vocal,
Nothing to say but what a day, how's your boy been?
And Paul's bass line. On to the next day.
For the benefit of Mr. Kite, this is take 1.
If turning advertisements into music was an official job title, John would stand squarely at the top. But this time, it was not a TV or newspaper advert, but an antique poster from 1843, announcing that Pablo Fenkay's Circus Royal was coming to town. And the circus would be for the benefit of a Mr. Kite, featuring Mr. J. Henderson. I wrote that as a pure poetic job. I had to write it because it was time to write, and I had to write it quick, because otherwise I wouldn't have been on the album. For the initial takes, John sang a guide vocal, Paul played bass, Ringo the drums, and George Harrison does not seem to have contributed. George Martin, however, once again stepped in to play the harmonium, and got his fair share of the instrument by the end of the session. I remember only too well pumping away with my feet at that bloody harmonium for hour after hour, trying to get it right, and being absolutely knackered, heart going at about 130 beats to the minute. It was like climbing up a steep flight of stairs non-stop. We would complete a take, I'd heave a sigh of relief, mop my sweaty brow, and then the dreaded call would come from John. I wouldn't mind doing that again. George, you all right there? The harmonium was a good idea though, because it established a vaguely circusy atmosphere to the song straight off. After we laid down the 4 basic rhythm tracks, you can hear John saying in an ironic voice,
I mean, it'll be on the bass.
Well, we'll have the Masked Alberts on by then, won't we?
The Masked Alberts were a bizarre and eccentric English comedy act, a duo I had recorded in the early days along with Spike Milligan. One of the Alberts played the trumpet rather badly, which is what John meant by his comment. It was time to add on the clever stuff, the brass.
Albert Records present the Morse Code Melody.
The session would end by overdubbing John's lead and backing vocals, with Paul and George joining.
The Hendersons will all be there, late of Pablo Fanky's fair, what a scene. And tonight Mr. Kite is topping the bill.
It was a must that the instrumental of the song evoke the atmosphere of a fantastical circus. John, as usual, was full of creative ideas, but was having trouble expressing them in practical terms. What I want, he explained earnestly to George Martin and me in the control room the next day, is some kind of swirly music, you know? George Martin didn't know. Lennon persisted. I want the sound of a fairground around my voice. I want to be able to smell the sawdust and the animals. I want to feel like I'm at the circus with Mr. Kite and the Hendersons and all that. George Martin put in considerable effort to find an antique steam organ to bring into the studio, but to no avail. Jeff Emmerich suggested that they dig into the EMI sound effects archive instead. So the engineering team got to work pulling tapes, but the tapes were composed composed of short snatches of music, which in their current state would not be able to be dropped into the track for atmospheric purposes. So the engineering team got weird with it. They grabbed a few pairs of scissors and began cutting the tape into much smaller pieces. They would then throw all the little bits in the air to randomize them before picking them all up and putting them back together. It was in this way that they created that swirling, chaotic sound. The process was tedious, and the Beatles, for once, probably felt a little bit of what their engineers felt on a near daily basis. Emmerich recalls, "We were in Studio 3 that night because our usual haunt, Studio 2, was in use by another artist. As a result, the group's gear wasn't in the studio with them. It was still being stored in Studio 2, where we would be returning for most of the rest of the album. Because they couldn't play and jam, the four Beatles were getting impatient with how long it was taking us to assemble the sounds. They were out in the studio area amusing themselves as best they could, but they kept popping into the control room saying, 'Aren't you lot done yet?' At one point, John came in, and he was actually quite aggravated, but Paul calmed him down, saying, 'Look, it's a process, and it just takes a certain amount of time. You have to expect that.' But by the time the engineers were finished, the Beatles and John were absolutely thrilled with the results.
One, two, three.
The hummed ending to A Day in the Life had not met expectations. Something greater was still needed. And Paul, who creatively was firing on all cylinders, brought into the studio an idea inspired by something as simple as a sustain pedal. I'd noticed that with the piano. If you hold down a pedal on the piano, how long the chord lasts. I'd just do it like a party piece with friends. I'd say, 'Listen to this.' I brought the idea in. 'Hey man, it goes on forever. We should do this at the end of a song and just have it go on.' Time to get to work. George Harrison and Neil Aspinall weren't present at the session today, as according to George Martin, I assumed they were doing something together. Nobody seemed surprised at their absence. The others must have known in advance, but John was quite annoyed. Nonetheless, the first step of the process was to attain the massive sound that the Beatles desired, so the team dragged into the studio every single piano they had on hand. According to Emmerich, these were 2 Steinway grand pianos, another Steinway upright that was purposely kept a bit out of tune for a honky-tonk effect, and a blonde wood spinet. To get as strong an attack as possible, everyone decided to play standing up instead of sitting down. John, Mal, and George Martin each stood behind a different piano, while Ringo and Paul shared the out-of-tune Steinway upright. I presume they did double duty because Paul had to coach his drummer on which notes to play. Because there were 4 hands slamming out the chord instead of 2, that ended up being the dominant instrument on the recording. John was really out of it that night, so Paul repeatedly counted everyone in.
No, well, I won't say 4, just imagine 4.
I was doing the other.
1, 2, 3.
It took quite a few takes to get a keeper because it was so problematic getting everyone to hit the start of the chord at exactly the same time. The next crucial piece of the puzzle was stretching the chord sustain as far as possible, and this would require far more than just depressing the pedal on the pianos. Let's hear again from Emmerich. Even if you hit a piano chord at full volume and hold down the sustain pedal, the sound only lasts for a minute or so before fading into nothingness. Compounding the problem was the fact that tape hiss and vinyl surface noise would obliterate any low-level signal all too soon. It seemed clear to me that the solution lay at keeping the sound at maximum volume for as long as possible, and I had 2 weapons that could accomplish this: a compressor, cranked up full, and the very faders themselves on the mixing console. Logically, if I set the gain of each input to maximum but started with the fader at its lowest point, I could then slowly raise the faders as the sound died away, thus compensating for the loss in volume. In effect, I could counteract the chord, getting softer, at least to some degree. In the end, they were so far up and the microphone so live that you could hear the air conditioning. It took 45 seconds to do, and we did it 3 or 4 times, building up a massive sound of piano after piano after piano, all doing the same thing. The chord was a fitting end to A Day in the Life. Shortly after the recording was completed, George Harrison finally showed up, accompanied by David Crosby of the Byrds. John ignored Crosby but couldn't resist hurling a little sarcasm at his bandmate. "Nice of you to turn up, George. You only missed the most important overdub we've ever done." With that, the day's work was complete. A Day in the Life was finished, a masterpiece composed of the entire band and team at their creative and technical best. The story will continue in Part 4. On June 22nd, 1967, music critic Tom Phillips of The Village Voice would write the following review of the Beatles' latest LP, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. A lot of people seem to have misunderstood the new Beatles album. Richard Goldstein, reviewing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in last Sunday's Times, calls it an album of special effects, dazzling, but ultimately fraudulent. He only likes the last song, A Day in the Life, a coda to an otherwise undistinguished collection of work. Without attempting a point-by-point refutation of Goldstein, I must say that I think the Beatles have scored a genuine breakthrough with Sgt. Pepper. Specifically, I think they've turned the record album itself into an art form. What you have here is not a weird coda to a series of unrelated songs, but a comment on a world created by those songs. The internal relationships may not be blatant, but they are real. And one way you can tell this is by noticing the strong sense of having been through something when you finish listening to all of Sgt. Pepper. My verdict, the most ambitious and most successful record album ever issued. The most significant artistic event of 1967. Welcome to Part 4 of the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. While I try to write these videos so each stands alone, if you would like to begin with Part 1, you can find it in the top right corner or in the description below.
I did a freak-out one then, one of them where you don't know what you're doing.
Lovely Rita is just another example of one of Paul's most superb gifts, writing characters. What this talent really comes down to is observation. He can spot a person on the street and in his head create a whole story about them. Nobody liked parking attendants or meter maids, so to write a song about being in love with a meter maid, someone nobody else liked, was amusing in itself. There was one particular meter maid in Portland Place on whom I based Rita. She was slightly military looking. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but those meter maids were never good looking. You never heard anybody say, "God, that's one stunning parking attendant." In any case, I caught a glimpse of Rita opposite the Chinese embassy in Portland Place. She was filling in a ticket in her little white book, the cap, the bag across her shoulder. It's sheer observation. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The secret to successful songwriting is the ability to paint a picture. And a real meter maid, one named Meta Davies, would later claim that she had inspired Paul to write the song, recalling in the paper, "His car was parked on a meter where the time had expired. I just put it on the windscreen when Paul came along and took it off. He looked at it and read my signature, which was in full. As he was walking away, he turned to me and said, 'Oh, is your name really Meta?' I told him that it was. 'That would be a good name for a song. Would you mind if I use it?' And that was that. Off he went." But Paul denies this story. As often happened, it was claimed by a girl called Rita, who was a traffic warden, who apparently did give me a ticket. I think it was more a question of coincidence. Anyone called Rita who gave me a ticket would naturally think, "It's me." I didn't think, "Wow, that woman gave me a ticket. I'll write a song about her." Never happened like that. It was a long day in the studio, but mostly just for Paul and the engineers. The Beatles banged out 8 takes of the basic rhythm track in good time, with Paul taking up the piano for the recordings. Paul then stayed behind while the rest of the band departed, taking his time to overdub his bass line. working with the already recorded rhythm track, which, as deftly put by engineer Jeff Emmerich, enabled him to hear the song as a whole, and therefore create melodic bass lines that perfectly complemented the final arrangement. He would do those overdubs in the wee hours, long after everyone else had gone home. The next day, Paul would pop in to record his lead vocal for the track.
Took her out and tried to win her. Had a laugh and over dinner. Told her I would really like to see her again.
On February 27th, the Daily Mail ran the following article. The father of 17-year-old Melanie Coe, the schoolgirl who seemed to have everything, spent yesterday searching for her in London and Brighton. Melanie had her own car. It was left, unlocked, outside her home when she vanished. She had a wardrobe full of clothes. She took only those she was wearing. She left her checkbook and drew no money from her account. She has been missing from her home for a week. Her father, businessman Mr. John Coe, said yesterday, "I cannot imagine why she would run away. She has everything here. We have spoken to her friends and visited places where she goes, but there is no trace of her. I only wish she would telephone us."
Right, now, concentrate, swinging. Cellophane flowers of yellow and green.
John has always vehemently denied that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds has anything to do with LSD. But John, far more than Paul or George, has always been a bit more coy when it comes to his lyrics. Another example off the top of my head is his denial that Happiness is a Warm Gun makes any reference to heroin.
And it also was about a gun, not about heroin or anything, and those days I had no idea about heroin. I'd never seen it, nor knew anybody that had ever touched it or taken it.
Which really is dubious to me.
I need a fix 'cause I'm going down.
There is no doubt, however, that the seed of inspiration was planted by a drawing that his son Julian brought home one day.
Well, we don't have much time left. Does anyone have any idea how much time we do have? Let me confirm quickly a couple rumors with you.
Yes.
One of them, has it ever been settled whether Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was a code for anything?
This is the truth. My son came home with a drawing and showed me this strange-looking woman flying around. I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." And I thought, that's beautiful. I immediately wrote a song about it. The song had gone out, the whole album had been published, and somebody noticed that the letters spelt out LSD, and I had no idea about it.
And Lucy, turns out, was a real girl, Lucy O'Donnell, who attended the Weybridge private nursery school with Julian. Paul recalls the day the song was written.
I said, we sat down. I contributed half of the song. I remember clearly arriving at John's place, it's in the book here, where he had this little drawing that Julian, his son, had done. And across the top of it, in this very naive children's writing, was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. John said, "What about that for a title?" I said, "Fantastic." He said, "Well, come on, let's go upstairs and write it," which we did.
Just like that. I remember coming up with cellophane flowers and newspaper taxis, and John answered with things like kaleidoscope eyes and looking glass ties. We never noticed the LSD initial until it was pointed out later, by which point people didn't believe us. When they came into the studio today, they were once more accompanied by a photographer and journalist from Life magazine. This journalist would be the one to ask Paul if he had ever taken LSD, to which Paul replied honestly, yes. But these were not the days of social media and instant news, so the story wouldn't break until the article was released months later. Like so many of John's songs, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds took a fair amount of rehearsing and rearranging to reach a recordable state. This pattern was something Jeff Emmerich would remark on. By now, it was evident that John's personality was changing. Instead of being opinionated about everything, he was becoming complacent. In fact, he seemed quite content to have someone else do his thinking for him, even when we were working on one of his songs. And a quick note here, there has been some discussion about Emmerich's recollections and his perceived bias for Paul. While it is important to take this into account, myself and every single person watching this video also has biases toward one person or another. The fact of the matter is, Emmerich's thoughts are invaluable, biased or not, as beyond George Martin, there was no one else as closely involved with with the Beatles' creative process during their career. EMI engineer Peter Vince would say, although they'd use the studio as a rehearsal room, you couldn't just clear off because they might be trying something out. What people don't realize is the boredom factor. Sgt. Pepper's took 4 months to record, and for probably more than half that time, all the engineers were doing was sitting around, waiting for them to get their ideas together. And this would also be touched on in the eventual Life article. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies, sings John over and over again. I begin to understand the remarkable process of the Beatles' music. It begins absolutely from scratch. It is now almost midnight in the recording studio, and after 4 hours of assault, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds still sounds quite terrible. Fifth Beatle Martin grimaces. We are light years from anything tonight, he shudders. They know it is awful now, and they're trying to straighten it out. It may be a week before they're pleased. If ever. They're always coming up with something new they've just learned, something I wouldn't dream of. They never cease to amaze me. I can't help but think George Martin said that last bit with a note of sarcasm in his voice.
Newspaper taxis appear on the shore, waiting to...
Despite the troubles of the day before, the Beatles actually began recording Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. They spent 7 takes on the rhythm track, with only a guide vocal from John. At the end of the day, John's guide vocal was wiped, and was replaced by a tambora drone, an idea from George Harrison.
Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. A girl with...
I've been hard on George throughout these Pepper videos. While there is no doubt his contributions so far had been far and in between, the dreamy and esoteric nature of Lucy in the Sky lended itself wonderfully toward George's continually budding passion for Indian composition and sounds. During vocals in Indian music, they have an instrument called a sarangi, which sounds like a human voice. And the vocalist and sarangi player are more and less in unison in a performance. For Lucy, I thought of trying that idea, but because I'm not a sarangi player, I played it on the guitar. In the middle 8 of the song, you can hear the guitar playing along with John's voice. Up next was the lead vocal, and John, most likely in space cadet mode, had an idea that was far more ridiculous than it was creative. He wanted to be hung up by a rope and spun around the microphone while he sang, to lend his vocal a psychedelic quality. Emmerich recalls, Mal was duly dispatched to see if he could find a rope so John could try out his theory. From the wink Mal gave me when he returned some hours later, empty-handed, I suspect that he had spent the evening in the pub instead. He knew how absurd and potentially dangerous the request was, and he probably guessed that John would have forgotten all about it by the time he got back, which of course is exactly what happened. His lead vocal, as well as Paul's harmonies, were recorded at 45 cycles per second, rather than the regular 50, so that when played at the normal speed, were a much higher pitch, giving their vocals that close to Mickey Mouse sound.
Look for the girl with the sun in her eyes. Look for the girl with the sun in her eyes.
Today, the Beatles returned to the title track, Sgt. Pepper's, after having last done recording work a month prior. It was time for the brass overdubs. One of the brass players, John Burden, would recall, they didn't really know what they wanted. I wrote out phrases for them based on what Paul McCartney was humming to us and George Martin. All 4 Beatles were there, but only Paul took an active interest in our overdub. Already the Beatles, primarily Paul, were working to create a real-life visualization of their alter Pepper egos. The Beatles' early days were defined by their English Chesterfield suits that they wore at the behest of Brian Epstein. And so, of course, the Peppers needed their own, equally defined image. The aesthetic they came up with was one that had already been percolating in the culture. At the time, everyone was into that I was Lord Kitchener's valet thing. Kids in bands wearing soldiers' outfits and putting flowers in the barrels of rifles. What? You don't know what I was Lord Kitchener's valet is? Time for a quick history lesson. What it was a clothing boutique. One that quickly gained popularity with the swinging London scene. Jimi Hendrix's iconic military coat, it was purchased from the boutique. In fact, this antique military aesthetic was the shop's bread and butter. And if you were an artist or musician hanging around London at the time, then you most likely bought a thing or two there. And remember a couple videos ago when I ridiculed Paul for wearing a Confederate general's costume? There's a very good chance that he purchased it at this very store. But the Sgt. Pepper uniforms were not purchased here. They were custom made by Bermans, who specialized in theatrical costumes. And during today's recording session, a representative from Bermans came by with fabric samples for the boys to look over, as they each wanted their own unique textures and colors. During all of this, George Harrison had been working meticulously for hours, hammering down the song's guitar solo, only for Paul to swoop in near the end of the session and record his own guitar solo, which was the one they ended up using. There was just one last piece to complete the title track, the sound effects. The boys wanted to give the song the impression of a live performance, of the Peppers introducing themselves before a crowd. Some of the sounds used were actually from the orchestral overdubs for A Day in the Life. But the rest were pulled from the EMI Sound Archive. These were Volume 28, Audience Applause and Atmosphere, and Volume 6, Applause and Laughter, the latter which was actually recorded by George Martin himself in 1961. We had an audience laughing on the front of Sgt. Pepper. It had always been one of my favorite moments. I'd listened to the radio a lot as a kid, and there had always been a moment in a radio show, say with somebody like Tommy Cooper, where he would walk on stage and he'd say hello, and they'd laugh, and my imagination went wild whenever that happened. I thought, what is it? Has he dropped his trousers?
Thank you very much. Oh, dear. I'm wearing my tails tonight. Do you like them?
It fascinated me so much. So when we did Pepper, there's one of those laughs for nothing in there. Before the Beatles came into the studio at 7 p.m., Paul continued to work on the visual side of Pepper. And it was around this time that he began to conceptualize the grand, revolutionary sleeve. Quick pause in the timeline here, because we have some catching up to do. On February 10th, the Beatles recorded the orchestral overdubs for A Day in the Life, a day of recording that was as much a party as anything. Included in the large group of guests was the design collective, The Fool. It's time I give a short backstory here, because I have mentioned the Fool Design Collective many times, and they were one of the most important figures in the development of what we now recognize as the psychedelic aesthetic. The original members of the collective were two Dutch artists, Simon Postuma and Mareka Koger. In 1966, they were living in Ibiza, Spain, where they designed clothes and were prominent faces in the area's little hippie community. One day, a photographer, Carl Ferris, stumbled upon the two of them and immediately recognized their talent. Carl Ferris was already beginning to dabble in the psychedelic, and on meeting with these two, would dive all the way into the aesthetic. It was Carl who shot and designed all three of Jimi Hendrix's studio album covers. Carl promptly shipped this Dutch duo into London, where they all three opened a studio together. Not long after, they would meet Barry Finch, a maverick public relations man in the music scene, who would link the collective up with Brian Epstein, securing their first official designer deal. Their work was everywhere. When the Beatles opened up their Apple boutique later in the year, it was The Fool who painted the incredible building facade. They also designed the costumes for the Beatles' All You Need Is Love worldwide television broadcast and the I Am the Walrus segment of Magical Mystery Tour. And when the Beatles were in the initial stages of planning the Sgt. Pepper album cover, the Fool were right at the top of the list as a potential candidate for designing it, and they were commissioned to produce sketches for the cover today, on the 10th. What they ended up producing was an admittedly striking and groovy piece of art, one which George especially loved, but Paul did not consider good enough. So Paul turned to the advice of gallerist Robert Fraser, who would end up becoming the unofficial art director for the album. And it was at his behest that Paul had over for supper today 2 individuals, Peter Blake and his wife Jan Haworth, both who were premier figures in the pop art scene. Paul approached the two with just the faintest of ideas. Look, we're on a little hill like this, and we have a floral clock there. What can we do with this? You can mess it round. I'm not fixed. I'd love your input. And from there, it grew. According to Peter Blake, a certain amount had already been established. The concept of there being a band within a band, for instance.
My main contribution, I think, was to decide that if we made the crowd in a certain way, it could be anybody. So I think that was that was the thing I would claim that really changed the direction of it.
After supper, it was studio time. Ever wonder what the bizarre, kazoo-like noises are in lovely Rita? How do you think they accomplished that effect? I'll give you 3 seconds to guess. Fantastic! You are correct. It was indeed toilet paper wrapped around combs. How did you know? Emmerich recalls, on that same very silly night, they overdubbed the heavy breathing at the end of the song, with John looning about and sending the others, and Richard and me up in the control room, into fits of laughter. The Beatles were also visited by a host of musicians today, those being Tony Hicks of the Hollies, David Crosby of the Byrds, and Sean Phillips, who claims he got to record some backing vocals for the track. Later in the day, David Crosby was given the privilege of listening to a song few others had heard. I was, as near as I know, the first human being besides them and George Martin and the engineers to hear A Day in the Life. I was high as a kite, so high I was hunting geese with a rake. They sat me down. They had huge speakers, like coffins with wheels, that they rolled up on either side of the stool. By the time it got to the end of that piano chord, man, my brains were on the floor. Time to record a new song, Getting Better. Paul and John were always writing together to some degree, though this song was more co-written than most at the time. It's an optimistic song. I often try and get on to optimistic subjects in an effort to cheer myself up, and also realizing that other people are going to hear this, to cheer them up too. But the song is most well known for John's portion of the track, a brutal and revealing admission of guilt that drops out from Paul's sunniness like a ton of bricks.
I used to be cruel to my woman, I beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved.
All that, I used to be cruel to my woman and beat her, that's me, because I used to be cruel to my woman and physically. Any woman. You know, I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I fought men, I hit women, I was violent. That's why I'm always on about peace. You see, it's the most violent people that go for love and peace. And I sincerely believe in love and peace. But I am absolutely a violent man who has learned not to be violent and regrets his violence.
And just the idea for it.
I've talked briefly about the discourse surrounding John as a partner and as a human being in general, and I plan to talk about it much more one day, so now is not the time. But from a musical context, to me, The brief verse serves as a perfect counterweight to the rest of the song, which without it would feel far shallower. That phrase specifically, getting better, was inspired by good old Jimmy Nichols, the man who filled in for Ringo while he had his tonsils removed. He had a penchant, when asked how he was doing, for saying, getting better. Despite being booked at 7 p.m., no Beatles showed until Ringo at 11 p.m., and recording wouldn't get underway until 1 a.m. This was an extreme example of behavior that was becoming frustratingly frequent for the boys' engineering team. To make matters worse, the Beatles' staple engineers, Emmerich and Lush, had the day off. So they worked with Malcolm Addy, who did not have much of a working relationship with the boys, and apparently, things did not go too smoothly. They recorded 7 takes of backing, the only interesting bit being that Paul played a pianette for the recording. Today, Jeff Emmerich returned to the studio after his day off. "Glad to have you back, Jeff," George Harrison said as soon as he walked in the door. Malcolm had clearly gotten on his nerves. When we played back the tapes of the previous evening's work in the control room, Ringo chimed in. "The drums sound a bit naff, don't you think?" George Harrison didn't even wait for an answer. Little wonder, considering that Malcolm didn't shut up long enough to get a decent drum sound. It was to be a day devoted to overdubs for getting better. Paul recorded his bass line. Ringo double-tracked some drum segments. And George once more overdubbed some tambura, which accentuates the shift in energy as the song drops into John's short verse. I really love it. It was time to overdub the brass for John's Good Morning, Good Morning. And brought in today were 3 musicians familiar to the Beatles, members of the Sounds Incorporated, who were also managed by Brian Epstein, and had opened for the Beatles during their 1965 tour. So the group sat down and caught up with each other, before the Beatles requested that the engineering team play the musicians the songs they were currently working on. Emmerich recalls, "I was studying the expressions of the Sound Incorporated guys, trying to measure their reactions to the tracks we were playing for them. They were mesmerized. We knew that what we had been doing was exceptional, but it was gratifying to see that kind of response from people fresh to the project. From that point on, every time anyone came to visit the Beatles on a session, Richard and I hoped that we would be asked to play back something that was completed or in progress, not just because we loved hearing the tracks, but because we enjoyed seeing the stunned looks on their faces. I've said this before, but it warms my heart to hear how much pride the engineers had in the work they helped to create. Despite the pains that came with working with a group of egos like the Beatles, not once did anyone take the music for granted. It was special. It was then time to record. These brass players, frankly, were not on the same caliber of the world-class musicians that were usually brought in for these recordings, and were only selected because John himself asked it, as he didn't want the brass to sound too, quote-unquote, straight. They had a difficult time with it. First off, they were having trouble with the rhythm of the arrangement, and when they did finally get it right, John kept repeatedly saying that it was too straight, and he wanted it weirder. Eventually, though, they had to settle for what they got, and weirding it up was left to the engineers, with Richard Lush saying, "We ended up flanging, limiting and compressing it, anything to make it sound unlike brass playing." It was typical John Lennon. He just wanted it to sound weird. George Harrison's contribution of Only a Northern Song weeks earlier had impressed nobody, and was so lacking, in fact, that George Martin pretty much told him he had to write something better to get on the album. and his response was this: Within You and Without You. He recalled, Within You, Without You came about after I had spent a bit of time in India and fallen under the spell of the country and its music. It was written at Klaus Vormann's house in Hampstead after dinner one night. The song was to be completely different from anything the Beatles had done to that point. And while yes, it is a Beatles song, no other Beatle but George played or even sung a note. While it may not sound anything near a traditional Eastern composition, to a listener from that region, as far as Western pop was concerned, never before had a song been so steeped in the sounds and style of Indian music. So simply put, it required Indian musicians. When George first came in with the song, he played it to everyone on his guitar, and while they preferred it to Only a Northern Song, again, no one was too impressed. But only George understood just what he had in mind. On the day of recording, George was excited but relaxed. He asked that carpets be brought into the studio and laid down to make the space feel more homey and help the Indian musicians feel comfortable. On their arrival, he was incredibly gracious and kind. It was clear that he respected them greatly. Work began. All the Beatles were present. Paul milled about for a while, somewhat curious, but John seemed skeptical and impatient. Once recording started, Paul and John sat off in the distance with the artists Peter Blake and Jan Haworth, still in the process of planning the cover art for the album. George was now to occupy a role that he had never been able to with John and Paul around, the leader. Despite not being fully versed in all of the intricacies of the instruments the musicians played, he was still able to communicate his ideas. George Martin recalls, George loved working with these musicians, and it was fascinating to see how his ideas grew and how easily he communicated the complex music to them. Indian rhythms can be extraordinarily difficult, and I have a fond memory of George speaking in a strange tongue, emphasizing the accents with a wag of his head. The Indian musicians cottoned on instantly. It was most impressive. We'll now hear from musician Buddhadev Kansara. My experience with the Beatles was excellent. They were nothing but nice people. Only George Harrison spoke to me, as he was the one who was passionate about Indian music. He asked me if I could play the tambura, and then we took about 5 to 6 minutes to come up with the tune. I was very surprised when I got the call, as I always wanted to meet the Beatles, as they were very popular. I only heard the music briefly and I didn't really think much of it, as it wasn't completed when I was working on it. It was only 3 to 4 years later when I finally heard the song in my shop and recognized it, that I thought, this is excellent. Just as was the case for all the session musicians the Beatles utilized throughout the years. They were paid, but were not credited. It didn't matter to me if people knew I was on that song. For me, it was about the experience of working with the Beatles. All these years later that I have received recognition, I am most happy that people still care for Indian music. The song was the longest the Beatles had recorded yet, and by a good margin. I'll take a moment to speak here personally. I think this is a fantastic song. Yes, it is slow and somewhat dreary, but the sonic landscape it creates is layered and immersive. Despite being so different from any other song on Pepper, it fits in perfectly. The overdubs of tambura throughout the earlier tracks serve as little breadcrumbs before the whole loaf presented here. One of my critiques in many of George's songs are the somewhat preachy nature of the lyrics. This is still present here, but somehow feels far more genuine. Remember the Daily News article about the runaway teenager I brought up earlier? It was, of course, this article that inspired Paul to write the song the Beatles began work on today, She's Leaving Home. Paul would later say, I set out to imagine what might have happened, the sequence of events. In addition to the newspaper report, I'm pretty sure another influence was the Wednesday play. It was a weekly television play that often addressed big social issues. It's the kind of thing people would be discussing at the bus stop on Thursday morning. When we recorded She's Leaving Home, it was almost like a shooting script for the Wednesday play. Clutching her handkerchief, quietly turning the back door key. And the story of the real runaway, Melanie Coe, is far too interesting not to share. Melanie Coe had actually met the band more than 3 years before She's Leaving Home was even written. During their appearance on the English television program Ready, Steady, Go on October 4th, 1963.
You're keen on budding Brenda Lees, are you?
Oh, yes.
I'll bet you are, yes. Right. Well, let's introduce the 4 contestants to you. They are, from left to right, Judy Johnson. Hello, Judy. June Dartnell. Hi, June. Hello, Kathleen Sullivan. Hi there. And hello to Melanie Coe. Right, they're all set to go, I hope, are you? Ready, Paul? Okay, off we go with Let's Jump the Broomstick.
Melanie had entered the on-air lip-syncing contest, which Paul was judging, and got to briefly chat with some of the Beatles beforehand. She would recall, at this point they were big, but they weren't the huge success they were about to become. Ringo was just adorable. He had all these rings on and he let us try them on. He was a lovely guy. So was George. He stood and chatted with us and asked us about our schools and what we were thinking of studying. They were both very sweet. Paul said hello and that was it, and I remember John was busy talking to some of the studio producers and didn't really acknowledge that we were there. Melanie would end up winning the contest.
A terrific performance from 4 would be Brenda Lees. Well, I wonder if our panel of judges has made up its mind and is unanimous.
Oh, yes, it has.
It is. It has.
Yes.
Yes. Paul, who's it going to be?
I think the winner, as far as I'm concerned, number 4.
Number 4, Melanie Coe. Here's a prize, Melanie, the LP from Paul, and all our congratulations. Very well done. Thank you.
I was very disappointed because there had been 2 shows before mine, and on both of those shows, the girl that won went out on a date with the pop star. I thought I was going to have a dinner date with the Beatles, so I was terribly disappointed with my prize. She was, however, awarded a year-long stint as a background dancer on the show, a position that drew no admiration from her parents, who wanted her to pursue dentistry. And a few years later, she would once again have a Beatles encounter. I was with a friend at the Bag O' Nails Club when I was 17, just before I ran away from home. She was from Hamburg, and she said she knew the Beatles very well, but I didn't believe her. We were sitting down having a drink, and in walks John Lennon with his entourage. And she waves to him and he comes over to us. "It's you, come join us." That's how it was. It would be years later that Melanie discovered that the song was written about her, and something that struck her was just how true to life the lyrics were. The most interesting thing in the song is what the father said. We gave her everything, everything money could buy. And in the newspaper article, my father actually says almost those words. He doesn't understand why I would have left home when they bought me or gave me everything. Which is true.
Her boyfriend wasn't then a man from the motor trade, but amazingly, Paul's lyric was almost right.
Well, he was a croupier, but previously, funnily enough, he'd actually worked in the car business. So he was a man from the motor trade, which is the lyric from the song. It's almost telepathic.
By the time work actually began, Paul had been itching terribly to record the song, and unfortunately, as a result of his impatience, the arrangement was not scored by George Martin, but by Mike Leander. Let's hear from George Martin. During the making of Pepper, Paul was also to give me one of the biggest hurts of my life. At the time, I was still having to record all my other artists. One day, Paul rang me to say, "I've got a song I want you to work with me on. Can you come round tomorrow afternoon? I want to get it done quickly. We'll book an orchestra, and you can score it." "I can't tomorrow, Paul. I'm recording Scylla at 2:30. "Come on, you can come round at 2 o'clock. "No, I can't. I've got a session on." "All right then," he said, and that ended the conversation. What he did then, as I discovered later, was to get Neil Aspinall, the road manager, to ring round and find someone else to do the score for him, simply because I couldn't do it at that short notice. In the end, he found Mike Leander, who could. The following day, Paul presented me with it and said, "Here we are. I've got a score. We can record it now." I recorded it with a few alterations to make it work better, but I was hurt. I thought, Paul, you could have waited. Paul obviously didn't think it was important that I should do everything. To me, it was. I wasn't getting much out of it from a financial point of view, but at least I was getting satisfaction. The score itself was good enough, and still holds up today, but it was the only score that was ever done by anyone else during all my time with the Beatles. It appears that Paul was the lone Beatle at the studio today, and as you could imagine, the atmosphere was tense between him and Martin. Paul would sit up in the control room while Martin conducted. Included in the group of musicians was harpist Sheila Bromberg, the first woman ever to record with the group, and the following recollection is shared by her.
And I was sitting here at 8:30, tuning the harp. A piece of music was plonked on my music stand. I gave it a brief look. Oh yeah, right. I recognised the Liverpool accent, turned round, of course it was Paul McCartney. Well, first of all, I played exactly what was written, which is, I'm reading the music here. Then I stopped and he said, no, I don't want that, I want something. So I thought, how can I make it different? I think he had an idea in his head of what he wanted it to sound like, but he couldn't describe it, he couldn't express it. During the session, after each time we played it, Paul McCartney, we'd hear the controls from the controls. No, I don't want that, I want something... So we play it again. Came midnight, and the string section were really fed up. And eventually the leader of the string orchestra stood up, Eric Grunberg, tucked his violin under his arm, says, now it is midnight, we have to go home because we are working in the morning. So a voice from the control box said, well, I suppose that's that then. And we all went home.
Despite Paul's pressing, they ended up using the very first recorded take for the song.
We gave her most of our lives, is leaving.
It was now time to tackle the lead and backing vocals for the song, which required a fair amount of finesse. I think that the following recollection from Emmerich is very striking. The lights in the studio were turned off to set the mood. The sole source of illumination was a table lamp next to the wall. The two Beatles, lifelong friends and collaborators, sat on high stools, facing each other, studying each other's lips intently for phrasing. Watching them, I remember thinking that John and Paul's voices were so different, yet so perfectly complemented each other's, just like their personalities and approach to music making. It wasn't an easy vocal to nail down either. At one point there was a long discussion about getting the right amount of emotion into the lyric. Paul was quite the perfectionist by this time, and he was really pissing John off by having him sing the same line over and over again.
We gave her everything money could buy.
Tuesday, March 21st, is a day that lives in infamy for one reason alone. It was the day that John inadvertently took LSD while in the recording studio. Despite frequent mentions of the boys being, quote, off their heads during recording sessions by the engineers, this was always due to some combination of weed, pep pills, aka amphetamines, and maybe the odd bump of cocaine now and then. But working under the influence of LSD was something that the Beatles had no desire to even attempt. In fact, the whole reason as to how John took acid was due to reaching into his little pep pill box for a little pick-me-up and inadvertently ingesting LSD instead. But first, before the chaos began, the Beatles got to work overdubbing the lead and backing vocals for Getting Better. They recorded several attempts, but not long into, John began to feel unwell. George Martin recalls, I was standing next to John, discussing some finer point of the arrangement to Getting Better, when he suddenly looked up at me. George, he said slowly, I'm not feeling too good. I'm not focusing on me. This was a pretty odd thing to say, even for John. I studied him. I'd been oblivious to it until then. But he did look pretty awful. Not sick, but twitchy and strange. Do you want someone to take you home? I asked. No, he replied. I don't want to go home. Come on, John, I said. What you need is a breath of fresh air. I know the way up onto the roof. When we had clambered out onto the flat roof of studio number 2, we found it was a beautiful clear night. John took a deep breath and, with a bit of a lurch, took a couple steps toward the edge of the building. I grabbed hold of his arm. It was a good 50 feet to the ground. We stood there for a minute or two, with John swaying gently against my arm. "I'm feeling better," he announced. Then he looked up at the stars. "Wow," he intoned. "Look at that. Isn't that amazing?" I followed his gaze. The stars did look good, but they didn't look that good. It was very unlike John to be over the top in that way. I stared at him. He was wired, pin-sharpened, quivering, resonating away like a human tuning fork. No sooner had John uttered his immortal words about the stars than George and Paul came bursting out onto the roof. They knew why John was feeling unwell. Maybe everyone else did, too. Everyone except for father figure George Martin here. It was very simple. John was tripping on LSD. The fact was that John was only too likely to imagine he could fly and launch himself off the low parapet that ran around the roof. They had been absolutely terrified that he might do so.
I never took it in the studio. Once I did accidentally, I thought it was taking some uppers. And I was not in a state of handling it, you know. And I can't remember what album it was, but I took it and then so scared on the mic, you know. I said, what was it? You know, I said, I feel ill. I thought I felt ill, and it was I thought it was going cracked, you know. And then I said, I must get some air, and they all took me upstairs on the roof, and George Martin was looking at me funny, you know. And then it dawned on me, I must have taken acid. And I said, well, I can't go on, I have to go. So I just said, you'll have to do it, and I'll just stay in and watch. And I was just, you know, like very nervous and just watching them all. Saying, is it all right? And they were saying, yeah, you know, all being very kind. And I said, yes, it's all right. And I said, are you sure it's all right? And I said, all right, you know, and they carried on making a record.
The day, however, was just beginning. Paul's lovely Rita still had a missing chunk in the middle. They had earlier attempted to record a Harrison guitar solo, but after a couple of hours, they realized it wasn't quite working. So Jeff Emmerich suggested they stick a piano solo there, to which Paul casually replied, "Sure, well why don't you play it?" This is a moment that Emmerich would come to regret. Due to a bout of musical shyness, he told Paul that he couldn't do it. So Paul gave it a stab, but wasn't happy with his attempts. Well, who better to step up at this moment than good old George Martin, who had contributed so many piano solos in his days with the Beatles. As he had already done several times before, most famously in My Life, George Martin played the solo at a slower speed before artificially speeding up the recording. But that was just one component of the sound. It was time for the engineers to get creative again, here utilizing some very unorthodox techniques. But first, a quick beat. As far as George Martin and the engineers' work is concerned, Sgt. Pepper is undoubtedly the most documented album. I have poured hours into reading recollections from both Martin and Emmerich, and one thing I've picked up on is how both of them will claim sole credit to some idea or process. They will both describe the same actions near verbatim, but almost always, they will say, I did this, rather than we did this. Is this simply a matter of flawed recollection, or is it a quirk of the ego? Who really knows? But regardless, it is a definite trend, and is once again the case here. I'll share Emmerich's recollection. Just know that Martin said the exact same thing. But in the true Pepper spirit of experimentation, Paul asked me to screw things up so the solo didn't sound like it was coming from a piano. This time around, I decided to place some sticky editing tape on the guide rollers of a tape machine that was sending signal to the echo chamber, causing the tape to wow and flutter. The end result was an audible and quite interesting wobble in the piano sound. As the Beatles were about to leave, Norman Smith walked into the studio. Now, Norman had worked as an engineer with the Beatles from their inception all the way up to Rubber Soul when he was promoted to work as a producer. Not even 2 years later, he began producing for an up-and-coming act named The Pink Floyd. And it was with the members of Pink Floyd that he turned up, uninvited, might I add. Now the Beatles, reaching the end of their workday, and very much aware that John was tucked away somewhere tripping on acid, did not at all greet the group warmly, and clearly were uninterested in any sort of social niceties at this time. After a few minutes of obligatory awkward chatting, Norman and the Pink Floyd got the message and promptly left the studio. As they left, John joined Paul and Mal Evans, the latter who drove them to Paul's home. On the way there, Paul decided that he would join John and take some LSD as well. This was only Paul's second trip and was to be his very first with John. His recollection here feels immensely important, so I am going to share it in almost its entirety. I thought, maybe this is the moment where I should take a trip with him. It's been coming for a long time. John's on it already, so I'll sort of catch up. It was my first trip with John, or with any of the guys. Me and John, we'd known each other for a long time. Along with George and Ringo, we were best mates, and we looked into each other's eyes. The eye contact thing we used to do, which is fairly mind-boggling. You dissolve into each other. But that's what we did, round about that time. That's what we did a lot, and it was amazing. You're looking into each other's eyes, and you would want to look away, but you wouldn't, and you could see yourself in the other person. It was a very freaky experience, and I was totally blown away. There's something disturbing about it. You ask yourself, how do you come back from it? How do you then lead a normal life after that? And the answer is, you don't. After that, you've got to get trepanned, or you've got to meditate for the rest of your life. You've got to make a decision which way you're gonna go. I would walk into the garden. Oh no, I've got to go back in. It was very tiring. Walking made me very tired, but I've got to do it for my well-being. In the meantime, John had been sitting around very enigmatically, and I had a big vision of him as a king, the absolute emperor of eternity. It was a good trip, but I wanted to go to bed after a while. I'd just had enough after about 4 or 5 hours. John said, "Go to bed? You won't sleep." I know that. I've still got to go to bed. But of course, you don't just sleep off an acid trip. So I went to bed and hallucinated a lot in bed. I remember Mal coming up and checking that I was all right. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I could feel every inch of the house, and John seemed like some sort of emperor in control of it all. It was quite strange. On the 23rd, the boys finished the vocal overdubs for Getting Better, after their work had been brought to a screeching halt by John's accidental LSD trip.
I used to get mad at my school. Now I can't complain. The teachers that taught me weren't cool. Now I can't complain. You're holding me down, turning me round, filling me up with your rules. I've got to admit.
The Beatles would take a short break and then return on March 28th to continue overdubbing. And 2 John songs were the focus today, Good Morning, and Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Paul would play the lead guitar on Good Morning, which according to Emmerich didn't do anything to improve George Harrison's mood. I can't imagine that it did. If we've learned anything from the Sgt. Pepper's sessions, it is how much fun John had with the textural work in his songs, to conceptualizing the orchestral overdub on A Day in the Life, to wanting to smell the sawdust and hear swirly music in Mr. Kite. John always brought to the table his unique, unorthodox ideas. And this would continue today. Here's George Martin. To follow the sound of the Kellogg's cockerel at the end of Good Morning, John had the idea of putting animal noises on it, and of putting these sounds in sequence. The idea was that we always had an animal that could swallow up the animal that came immediately before it. John had actually thought this through to the extent that he'd written down a list of the animals he wanted on there, in order. The sounds were of course pulled from the EMI archive. Now it was time to return to Mr. Kite. As we covered in the last video, George Martin and Jeff Emmerich painstakingly put together the atmospheric, swirly circus music that John desired by digging through the sound archive, cutting up bits of tape, and then stitching it back together to create something that sounded musical, but completely out of control. With that textural work in place, it was time to reel in the madness by overdubbing some quote-unquote real music to slide on top of it. John and George Martin both played some organ, Paul added some electric guitar, Ringo some tambourine, and even Mal Evans joined in on the fun by playing his enormous bass harmonica. I could not imagine an instrument more befitting for him. All of this was recorded at half speed, so that when played back at normal speed, the instrument sounded frantic and surreal. How often have you heard me say this? The final song written for Sgt. Pepper is the endearing and sincere, with a little help from my friends. Undoubtedly my favorite Ringo-led track, and it is also one of the more collaborative Lennon-McCartney songs written in the band's later years. From the jump, they knew this was one to be given to Ringo. Poking a little fun at Ringo was actually a lot of fun. What would you do if I sang out of tune? Actually, John and I wrote this song within a vocal range that would cause no problems for Ringo, and I think that's one reason why it was such a great success for him. The song was performed very much in the style of the Sgt. Pepper album as a whole, the style of a live show, in which the song is sung by a certain Billy Shears. For those old enough to remember, Billy Shears was the name of the person who supposedly replaced me in the Beatles when I'd died after a road accident in 1966. That was a crazy rumor that had been doing the rounds. Now Billy Shears showed up, large as life, in the guise of Ringo Starr. This song contains one of my favorite lines in a Beatles song, one that could be interpreted any number of ways, but I have always thought was especially poignant. That is,
What do you see when you turn out the light?
I can't tell you, but I know it's mine.
which according to Paul, may have just been some veiled crude humor. It could have been him playing with his willy under the covers, or it could have been taken on a deeper level. This was what it meant, but it was a nice way to say it, a very non-specific way to say it. I love it nonetheless. Recording began. Just as he had done for A Day in the Life, Emmerich loosened the skins on Ringo's toms to give them that deep, resonant boom. They recorded 10 takes of backing, with Ringo on drums, Paul on piano, George on electric guitar, and John on cowbell. The session went late into the night and into the next morning. Emmerich recalls, Richard and I watched an exhausted Ringo begin to trudge up the stairs. That was our signal, as usual, that the session was over, and we began to relax. He was at the halfway point when we heard Paul's voice call out, "Where are you going, Ring?" he said. Ringo looked surprised. "Home. To bed." "Nah, let's do the vocal now." Ringo looked to the others for support. "But I'm knackered," he protested. To his dismay, both John and George were taking Paul's side. "No, come back here and do some singing for us," John said with a grin. Fortunately for us all, Ringo got his lead vocal done relatively quickly. Perhaps the shock tactic of having him sing when he was at least expecting it took the nervousness away. Or perhaps it was just how supportive everyone was being. All three of his compatriots gathered around him, inches behind the microphone, silently conducting and cheering him on as he gamely tackled his vocal duties. It was a touching show of unity among the four Beatles. The only problem was the song's last high note, which Ringo had a bit of trouble hitting spot on. For a while he lobbied to have the tape slowed down just for that one drop-in, and we tried it, but even though it allowed him to sing on pitch, it didn't match tonally to the rest of the vocal. He sounded a bit silly, almost like one of the goons. "No, Ring, you've got to do it properly," Paul finally concluded. It took a few tries, but Ringo finally hit the note, and held it, without too much wavering. Amid the cheers of his bandmates and a Scotch and Coke toast, the session finally ended.
From my friend.
The big day had arrived. It was time to shoot the iconic Sgt. Pepper album cover. It had taken weeks to prepare the photography studio. On first glance, it may be easy to mistake the cover as a collage, a scrapbook-style imposition of different cutouts, laid flat and stitched together. This is not the case. The Beatles, and everything around and behind them were tangible and real. The lineup of famous figures in the background were picked by Robert Fraser, Jan Haworth, Peter Blake, and obviously the Beatles, though mostly by John and Paul. George picked out 3 Indian gurus for his selection, and as far as I can tell, the only person Ringo suggested that made the cover was Issy Bon. Famously, John wanted 3 controversial figures on the album cover, the first being Adolf Hitler. Jan Haworth recalled, "John wanted Adolf Hitler, which I thought was a very ugly choice, beyond provocative. I have no idea what his thinking was," which I have to agree with. Along with that, he also wanted Jesus and Gandhi. Jesus' name was thrown out pretty quickly, though Gandhi very nearly made the cover.
Anyway, he came round to my house. He said, "I'm afraid, old chap, we can't have Gandhi." I said, "What do you mean? Gandhi? He's all right. You know, what's wrong with him?" "Well, I'd offend the Indians."
They were very important. We shouldn't upset India. And in his particular case, I refused to have anything to do with it immediately.
Of all the faces the Beatles themselves chose, there were no women. Not trying to stir anything up here, just thought it was worth noting. The pictures of these individuals were mostly sourced from photo libraries, such as the BBC Radio Times Holton Picture Library, though some were obtained from personal sources, such as Stuart Sutcliffe's, which his family mailed over. The photos were enlarged to life size in the lab, and then printed out and mounted onto hardboard. Almost all of these photos were originally in black and white, and so had to be meticulously tinted, a task that was primarily performed by assistant Nigel Hartnett and Jan. The Sgt. Pepper drumhead was contributed by fairground painter Joe Fgrave, who had worked with Jan previously. The set itself was constructed in the studio of the photographer who would capture the album cover, Michael Cooper. The wax figures, borrowed from the one and only Madame Tussauds, were a last-minute addition. The Beatles arrived at the studio. The shoot was to take about 3 hours in total, and was a delicate balancing act of visual depth, lighting, and arrangement. Let's share a bit of recollection from photography assistant Nigel to paint the scene that day. Soul music was throbbing constantly in the studio, headed by Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Booker T. Few people stood still. Everybody was moving some part of their body with the beat. The joint was jumping, as they say. It was a strange time. With so many full-size figures around, I would find myself dodging dummies, as if they were real people, and then bumping into someone because I thought they were a cutout, and was surprised when they moved. So many people were smoking that the atmosphere was thickening and threatening the air quality. I have to say that it was not just tobacco, but lots of weed was being passed around. The 3 of us didn't partake until it was all finished, as we had serious work to do. In the photograph, the Beatles stare intently into the camera, a decision that Paul McCartney recalls was influenced by, "I had seen a thing on TV about eye contact in apes, so with Michael Cooper's inside photo, we all said, 'Now, look into the camera and really say, I love you.' If you look at it, you'll see the big effort in the eyes." When the shoot finally finished, most of the incredible set ended up junked, which, even without the benefit of retrospect, seems somewhat baffling. One of the artifacts that did survive, that being the painted drumhead, would go for over $1 million at auction in 2008. While history has assigned Peter Blake the bulk of the credit for the cover's design, so many artists contributed.
Things happened like there was a young boy who was helping who said, "Oh, could I do a guitar in hyacinths?" And it was such a nice sort of gentle, sweet idea that we said, yes, certainly. So this sort of white shape at the front is actually a guitar. One of the myths that rose was that you can read that as P-A-U-L ? When the stories of Paul's death were rife, this was a sign that Paul had indeed died. But of course it was never intended to be P-A-U-L ? It's simply a guitar.
Bye.
The album was nearly complete. In just 2 days, Paul would be flying off to America to visit Jane Asher, who was currently touring in a theater performance of Romeo and Juliet. to tie the album's whole concept neatly together, the idea of a reprisal was floated, not by any of the Beatles or engineers, but by Neil Aspinall. You're giving a concert, why don't you wrap up the concert with another version of Sgt. Pepper? Due to the last-minute nature of the idea, the Beatles recorded not in their usual Studio 2, but in Studio 1, a space that was far more reverberant, and contributed to the slightly more live and bright sound of the reprisal. This effect, though, would have been distractingly present, if not for the efforts of Emmerich and Lush. First, I had Richard and the maintenance engineer on duty gather up all the available tall screens and build a kind of hut, thus creating a smaller room within a room. Then I asked Mal and Neil to set up the drums and amplifiers very near one another, so that there would be minimal delay on the signal that would inevitably spill between the mics. It was an 11-hour session and the studio atmosphere was electric. The Beatles had fun recording a faster, livelier version of a song they already knew front to back. Emmerich recalls, "Everybody was really upbeat that day, and it shows. It was a great rhythm track, and I could feel the excitement building from the very first moment, even in Paul's count-in, which had a tremendous energy of its own." Ringo was pounding the hell out of his drums. He was even stomping on the bass drum pedal harder than usual. In fact, everyone was playing full out. Considering that they'd all been cloistered in the studio for so long, pouring their hearts and souls into the album, it really was incredible how good and tight their playing was. The recording was complete. With that, the Beatles had created a masterpiece. But beyond the music, we still have some loose ends to tie up. So, you've already spent an enormous amount of money and time designing and shooting the most ambitious album cover ever conceived. A cover containing the faces of over 50 famous individuals. Surely you went through the trouble of attaining permissions from these people before you went through the hubbub of everything else. Of course not. In fact, with Brian Epstein suffering immensely from his drug use at this period, no one had even considered this technical difficulty until EMI themselves brought it up.
They'd been refused permission by the EMI music department to issue this cover because there were massive, important people on it. And Paul McCartney said, "There's no risk whatsoever. Everybody on here will be delighted." I said, "Well, that's what you think, and I hope you're right."
They requested that every single person present on the cover provide permission for their inclusion, and had the Beatles publisher, NME, set aside $20 million in case of lawsuits. The person set to lead this overwhelming task was Brian Epstein's assistant, Wendy Hansen. Well, former assistant actually, as she had resigned not long before all this madness due to the difficulty of working with Brian in the throes of his drug addiction. So she was hired on a freelance basis, as Brian had nowhere else to turn. Brian asked me to try and get legal clearances from everybody within a week. EMI wasn't keen on the cover, but Paul wanted to do it. It was an incredible job. I spent many hours and pounds on calls to the States. Some people agreed to it, but others wouldn't. Fred Astaire was very sweet, and Shirley Temple wanted to hear the record first. I got on famously with Marlon Brando, but Mae West wanted to know what she would be doing in a Lonely Hearts Club.
Mae West wrote back and said, "What would I be doing in the Lonely Hearts Club? No, I won't be on it." So then I think it was suggested that the Beatles all wrote her a personal letter and said, "We'd very much like you to be on it." Then she said yes, she would.
Thankfully, due to the Beatles' high regard, they received permission from almost every single person on the sleeve, with not a penny paid to any of them, which nowadays would never occur. The one individual who did want money was Leo Gorcey of the Bowery Boys, who requested $500. According to Paul, he was on the back now, so they just put a bit of blue sky where he had been.
Nothing happened from that day to this. As far as I know, not a single complaint came from anybody. Nobody asked to be left off the record.
We still have another novelty to cover, that being the back cover. The Beatles decided that they wanted the lyrics to all the songs printed in full on the back, which would be the first time this had ever been done for a rock LP. They once more had to negotiate an agreement with EMI, who were worried that the inclusion of the lyrics would hurt the sales of the sheet music to be later distributed. All in all, the conception, execution, and then negotiations surrounding the album cover had been more elaborate and time-consuming than any cover art ever created. Paul would say, "We fought like devils, I tell you, but I see no reason why you shouldn't fight for things like that. It was like, we're the Beatles. It's not as if we're some shitty act. We're making you a lot of money. It's not as if you couldn't give us a little bit back. All we're trying to do is give people a great deal. They'll buy more because it's a great deal, and they'll come back for the next one." So it all seemed very wise to us. On April 3rd, Paul would fly with Mal Evans to San Francisco. And if you would like to continue the Beatles story from there, you can do so in part 1 of the Making of Magical Mystery Tour. This has been a tremendous undertaking, and by far my most detailed recounting of any period in the Beatles' history. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. And if you want to watch videos early and help me to continue to make these videos, also consider supporting me on Patreon. You can do so for only $1 a month, and it helps a lot. Thank you so much for watching.